Have you ever noticed something strange about human history? We hunted mammoths, deer, bison, fish, and birds by the millions. Yet we almost never built our survival around eating the animals that hunt other animals. Not lions, not wolves, not bears. And the reason is far deeper than fear. It is hidden inside one of the coldest laws in nature. The higher you climb up the food chain, the less energy remains. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because once you see the 10% energy rule, the entire logic of human survival starts to look very different. The fire is low, the light unstable, and on the edge of that light lies a fact so ordinary that it almost escapes notice. Human beings have eaten deer, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, antelope, rabbits, mammoths, bison, seals, birds, shellfish, roots, grains, fruits, and fish in astonishing variety. They have crossed deserts for herd animals, built empires on grazing land, and shaped entire landscapes around creatures that feed on grass. But what they almost never do, across most of history and in most places, is base their survival on eating the great hunters that stand above them in the wild. Wolves may threaten the camp, lions may haunt the dark edge of the plain, bears may wander into the valley, sharks may move below a boat in cold green water. Human beings kill such animals at times. They fear them, revere them, wear them, display them, turn them into stories, symbols, warnings, trophies, gods, enemies, and tests of courage. Yet as food, they occupy a strangely minor place. For a species willing to eat almost anything, that absence deserves attention. The mystery becomes sharper the longer one looks at it. Human beings are themselves highly successful predators. They are not delicate herbivores nervously nibbling at safety. They are tool makers with binocular vision, coordinated hunters, endurance walkers, planners, trappers, ambushers, and scavengers who become something more dangerous than any clawed rival because they can remember, cooperate, and return with better weapons. They can bring down animals far larger than themselves. They can drain marshes, burn grasslands, redirect rivers, and learn the habits of prey across generations. They can watch a track in wet soil and tell a story from it. They can stand in a clearing and decide, not merely what lives there now, but what will live there a century later. If any creature should have made a habit of eating other predators, it ought to have been this one. And yet the historical record, the ethnographic record, and the simple pattern of human diets all point in another direction. When people want reliable meat, they usually turn downward in the food chain, not upward. At first glance, the answer appears obvious. Predators are dangerous. That is true, but only partly true. Plenty of the animals humans regularly hunt are dangerous. A wounded boar can tear a man open. A cornered bison can crush him. An aurochs was not a gentle creature. Wild buffalo, elk, giant deer, walrus, and even some birds can kill the inattentive hunter. Danger alone does not explain the pattern, nor does taste. Humans have eaten enough different things under enough different circumstances to make it very difficult to claim that predators are simply unpalatable by nature. In some regions, bears are eaten. In some places, large fish that prey on smaller fish are eaten. In some periods, lions, big cats, crocodiles, and dogs appear in kitchens, rituals, famines, or royal displays. The evidence remains incomplete, and the details vary from one society to another, but the broad pattern survives all the same. These are exceptions. They do not become the great dependable base of human nourishment. They do not fill the role that grazing herds fill. They do not usually sustain villages, armies, or civilizations. That imbalance matters because food is never merely about appetite. It is about effort, risk, time, and the invisible arithmetic that governs survival long before anyone puts numbers to it. A human community does not need food in the abstract. It needs calories returned for calories spent. It needs predictability. It needs enough fat at the right time of year, enough protein without wasting labour, enough stored energy to last through winter, drought, migration, childbirth, sickness, and bad luck. Hunters in deep prehistory do not speak in the language of ecology textbooks, but they know the difference between an animal that is worth following and an animal that is not. They know which tracks promise a heavy carcass and which promise a long day ending in blood, danger, and very little food. They know where the odds lie, even when they have no formal theory for why. What survives in the record suggests that over immense stretches of time, humans learn a lesson so basic that it disappears into common sense. The best animals to eat are usually not the ones that eat other animals. This is where the story begins to widen. The choice is not simply cultural and not simply instinctive. It is built into the structure of life itself. A wolf chases deer because that is what a wolf must do. A lion kills zebra because grass cannot feed a lion directly. A shark hunts fish because it cannot graze the sea. Each predator lives on concentrated packets of energy that have already passed through other bodies. By the time nourishment reaches the top of a food chain, much of it has already been spent. It has been burned in muscle, lost in heat, used in movement, wasted in struggle, dissolved in the daily cost of staying alive. The higher an animal stands in that chain, the more expensive it becomes, not in money, but in the oldest currency on Earth, usable energy. Scholars still debate how consciously ancient peoples understood these patterns, but they hardly needed equations to feel their effects. Repeated failure teaches quickly. Repeated abundance teaches more quickly still. Imagine a plain at the end of the dry season. The grass looks dead from a distance, but it is not dead. It is stored sunlight. It moves into antelope by the thousand, into wildebeest, horses, gazelles, cattle, and deer. It becomes muscle, liver, marrow, hide, bone grease, blood, and especially fat if the season has been kind. Then lions move after the antelope. Hyenas circle the lions. Scavengers follow the hyenas. Parasites wait for everyone. To the human eye, the lion seems more impressive than the antelope. It is stronger, rarer, more feared, more glorious in story. But the antelope is the better answer to hunger. It is part of a crowd. It eats what humans usually cannot digest in bulk. It turns low, abundant plant matter into food that can be carried back to camp. It stands not as the king of the landscape, but as the landscape converted into flesh. The lion, by contrast, is the remnant of many antelopes already spent. It is the narrowed, expensive end of a long biological funnel. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. There is something almost poetic in the fact that human beings, for all their ambition, remain bound to this quiet logic. They dominate ecosystems, yet they do not escape them. They build traps, bows, spear throwers, nets, corrals, gunpowder weapons, steel hooks, and industrial trawlers. But the old rule continues to shape outcomes beneath every technological layer. To feed many people well and often, one normally harvests from lower levels. One eats the animals that eat plants, or eats the plants directly, or captures creatures from systems so productive that they function like broad living machines. The giant hunters at the top draw attention because they are dramatic. They look like power. They occupy the imagination. But imagination and subsistence are not the same thing. A society can admire the wolf and still fill its granaries with barley. It can tell stories about the tiger and still rely on pigs, goats, fish, and rice. It can worship the eagle and still eat sheep. That difference between symbolic importance and practical nourishment runs through human history in revealing ways. Predators often enter culture more vividly than they enter the cooking pot. They become ancestors, monsters, badges of rank, emblems of kingship, protective spirits, rivals in myth, or embodiments of wilderness itself. Their teeth are worn as ornaments. Their skins become cloaks. Their heads decorate gates and halls. Their presence changes how people build fences, move livestock, arm themselves, and imagine the unknown. In some places, the act of killing a predator becomes a public performance of bravery. In others, eating one may carry prestige precisely because it is unusual. Yet all of this only underlines the central point. The predator is special because it is not normal food. The very rarity of the meal gives it meaning. No one builds a world on rarity. And so the puzzle sits there in plain sight. Human beings are among the most flexible eaters the planet has ever produced. They move from Arctic ice to tropical forest, from mountain plateau to tidal estuary, from open savanna to dense city. They invent cuisines from necessity and desire. They eat fresh, dried, fermented, smoked, roasted, raw, boiled, salted, curdled, pounded, and buried foods. They can turn bitterness into delicacy and scarcity into ritual. Yet even such a species tends, again and again, to avoid making predators into ordinary food. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is not only fear, taboo, or tradition, though all of those matter in places. It is tied to a deeper law that governs every landscape where life feeds on life. The law is severe, but elegant. Most energy is lost on the way up. Once that is understood, a great deal of human history begins to look different. The rise of hunting strategies, the value of herds, the logic of domestication, the shape of cuisines, the meaning of scarcity, and even the strange status of dangerous animals all start to fall into place. What seems at first like a detail of taste becomes a story about ecology, biology, risk, and time. It becomes a story about why some animals can feed multitudes while others can barely justify the effort of killing them. It becomes a story about why the world has so many mouths at the bottom and so few at the top. And it becomes, in the end, a story about humans themselves. Because the species that learns to dominate the food web still cannot break the arithmetic of the food web. It can only work within it, exploit it cleverly, disguise it with culture, and sometimes forget that it is there. By the light of that first fire, none of this is written down. There are no diagrams scratched into the dirt, no formal laws, no percentages, no language of trophic levels. There is only experience. There is the memory of hard pursuit and meagre return. There is the heavy body of a grazing animal dragged home at dusk. There is the dangerous flash of claws in brush, and the knowledge that such a kill, even if successful, will not feed the group for long enough to justify chasing it often. There is the beginning of an old human wisdom, learned not in words but in outcomes. Some flesh carries a landscape inside it. Some carries only the cost of the chase. Across continents and centuries, humans keep discovering the difference. Long before any hunter lifts a spear, long before any hoof strikes dust or any tooth closes on flesh, the real movement begins elsewhere, in a place so quiet it is easy to overlook. It begins in light. Sunlight falls across grasslands, wetlands, forests, kelp beds, floodplains, and reed-choked riverbanks, and from that light the whole architecture of hunger starts to rise. Leaves open to it, algae drift within it. Tiny green cells seize it and do something so fundamental that nearly every struggle above them depends on it. They take energy that arrives from 93 million miles away and, for a moment, pin it inside matter. They turn light into stored life. From that moment onward, everything that hunts, grazes, burrows, browses, or scavenges is living on borrowed sunlight, however distant the chain may become. This is the first deep truth behind the human preference for some animals over others. Food webs are not simply lists of who eats whom. They are systems for transferring energy through loss. Every living thing must spend what it gains. A plant uses energy to grow stems, defend itself chemically, repair damage, spread roots, lift water, produce flowers, make seeds, and survive drought, shade, insects, and disease. Even before another creature takes a bite, much of that captured sunlight is already committed. Then the herbivore arrives, a deer, antelope, hare, aurochs, wild sheep, or mammoth feeds on material that is often tough, fibrous, seasonal, and difficult for many other animals to use. Through a complex machinery of teeth, gut bacteria, stomach chambers, and relentless feeding, it performs one of the great biological transformations on Earth. It turns leaves and grass into blood, muscle, marrow, sinew, organ meat, hide, and fat. It turns the open land into edible movement. That conversion is neither magical nor efficient, but it is immensely important. A meadow may look empty to a hungry human if he cannot digest the cellulose that fills it. To a grazing animal, the same meadow is a vast low green reservoir. The herd is the translator between the landscape and the campfire. It eats what people largely cannot and converts it into a form people can. That is why so much of human history bends toward herbivores. They're not merely animals among animals. They are biological middlemen standing between raw plant production and human hunger. The evidence from archaeology, ethnography, and ecology points repeatedly in the same direction where herbivores are abundant and catchable. Human beings tend to organize much of their meat economy around them. Once one sees that, the landscape changes character. A plain is no longer just scenery. It is a machine of conversion. Grass feeds gazelle feed lions, hyenas, and occasionally people. Shrubs feed goats and ibex. Reeds feed waterfowl. Seeds feed rodents. Fruit feeds monkeys and birds. Everywhere. The first transfer of energy out of plants creates possibilities that did not exist before. Yet every transfer comes at a cost. An herbivore cannot keep all the energy it eats. It burns most of it simply staying alive, moving, breathing, regulating body temperature, growing bone, healing wounds, digesting food, escaping danger, surviving winter, competing for mates, producing milk, raising young. This means that an animal is never a perfect storage vessel. It is a leaking vessel, alive only because energy is flowing through it and out of it at all times. Predators enter a world already shaped by those losses. A wolf does not eat grass. A lion does not crop sedges beside a river. A bear may be more flexible, but even then its richest animal food often comes through other creatures that have already done the first labor of conversion. To eat a herbivore is to tap into a body that has processed the landscape once. To eat a predator is to tap into a body that is often living on bodies that already processed it once before. the chain lengthens. The losses accumulate. No single explanation fully accounts for every human dietary pattern, because culture, climate, technology, and local ecology all matter. But beneath all of that variation lies a basic physical reality. The higher one climbs through a food chain, the less total energy is available to support flesh. In practical terms, this means nature can support many more animals that eat plants than animals that eat those animals. That imbalance is visible everywhere once one learns to notice it. Herds can cover plains in numbers that seem almost impossible. Tens of thousands of wildebeest, reindeer, saiga, bison, springbok, or zebras may move across a region when conditions allow. By contrast, the predators that depend on them are few. They must be few. The landscape cannot afford too many mouths at the top because the flow upward narrows at every step. A valley may hold enough vegetation to support a great mass of herbivores, yet only a scattering of large carnivores. Those carnivores are vivid because rarity makes them vivid. They are noticed because danger sharpens attention. But abundance decides subsistence, not drama. For prehistoric people, this would have been less an abstract principle than a pattern repeated so often it became woven into judgment. If one spends a day following the tracks of wolves, one may find almost nothing to eat by nightfall. The wolves themselves are swift, wary, social, and difficult to approach. If one instead positions a hunt near a migration path, a river crossing, a salt lick, a game trail, or a narrowing in the terrain used by grazing animals, the odds change. The human body feels the difference before the human mind explains it. More animals, more edible tissue, more useful byproducts, more predictable return. What survives in the record suggests that human foragers, especially skilled and observant ones, understood ecosystems with great practical depth. They may not have spoken of primary production and trophic transfer, but they knew where life thickened and where it thinned. This is also why predator-rich landscapes do not necessarily mean food-rich landscapes for humans. A territory full of lions, leopards, wolves, eagles, and hyenas may seem from a distance rich with animal life. Yet those animals are signs that much of the usable energy has already passed through a series of filters. They are the visible edge of a much larger invisible base. The real wealth lies beneath them, in grass, shrubs, seeds, tubers, insects, and especially in the herds and smaller prey that draw the hunters in. A land without predators might be ecologically damaged, but a land with only predators would be impossible. Their very presence testifies to a broader abundance at lower levels. The great hunters are not the foundation. They are the costly ornament at the narrow end of the pyramid. That pyramid is not perfectly rigid. Nature is too complicated for that. Some animals eat across levels. Pigs root through almost anything. Bears shift with season and opportunity. Humans themselves are omnivores of unusual versatility. Aquatic ecosystems sometimes blur familiar categories, and scholars still debate exactly how some ancient diets should be classified, especially when marine resources become important. Even so, the general pattern holds. Life begins with broad, diffuse capture at the bottom and moves upward through contraction. Each stage depends on what came before. Each stage supports less total mass. Each stage is more selective, more precarious, more expensive to maintain. By the time one reaches the top predators that dominate myth and command fear, one is looking at creatures supported by a long chain of prior consumption, each link paying its own living costs all along the way. There is an irony here that matters for human history. The animals that seem most impressive to human eyes are often the least suitable as staple meat for precisely the reason they seem impressive. They are fast because they must hunt. They are powerful because they must overpower prey. They are territorial because resources are limited. They are rare because the system cannot sustain many of them. All of those traits make them dangerous, but they also make them poor candidates for regular human feeding strategies. The lion embodies success at one scale and inefficiency at another. It is an excellent lion. It is a poor pantry. Early humans almost certainly sensed this through repetition across generations. One valley yields antelope season after season. Another offers fish when the waters rise. A marsh provides birds, eggs, and reeds. A woodland offers nuts, boar, and browsing animals. But the top predators remain intermittent presences. They are encountered, avoided, copied, feared, sometimes hunted, sometimes scavenged, sometimes killed defensively, occasionally consumed, yet they do not form the reliable core. The camp cannot depend on rarity. Children cannot be raised on symbolic victories. A group living too close to the margins learns quickly that daily survival belongs to what is abundant enough to matter. This helps explain something deeper than menu choice. It explains the emotional geography of ancient landscapes. Human beings do not merely seek food, they learn to read the layers beneath food. A hill slope full of grazing signs means possibility. Fresh droppings, cropped stems, hoof prints, and trampled earth mean stored energy is moving through large bodies nearby. A sky full of vultures may mean death and opportunity together. The spoor of a great predator means danger, but it also means prey exists in the surrounding terrain. The best human hunters are reading a map of energy, though no such word need exist in their language. They are locating where sunlight has become flesh in the most accessible way. And so the world that humans inherit is not one flat field of equal edible choices. It is a structured gradient. At the broad base lies an immense living accumulation of plant matter, most of it unusable directly for much of human prehistory except in selected forms. Above that stand the creatures capable of harvesting it at scale. Above them stand the creatures that hunt those harvesters. Above them, fewer still. This layered arrangement shapes not just animal populations, but the logic of every human food decision. It determines why some carcasses are worth defending, drying, sharing, storing, and returning for. It determines why certain migrations attract human movement like magnets. It determines why the dream of feeding many people by chasing the hunters of the wild is usually just that, a dream. By the time the firelight catches a rack of antlers at the entrance to a shelter, or flickers across drying strips of meat hung on wooden poles, the mathematics of the living world has already made its judgment. Most of the energy from the original sunlight is gone, burned in roots, leaves, hooves, muscles, lungs, fear, flight, mating, milk, and endless motion. What remains is precious precisely because so much has been lost to make it possible. Human beings, like all other animals, live inside that narrowing current. They can be clever within it. They can widen access with tools and planning. They can shift habitats and exploit seasonal peaks. But they cannot repeal the pattern. The higher the flesh, the thinner the stream. In that sense, every ancient meal contains a hidden history of transfers. The marrow cracked from a long bone carries summer grass inside it. The fat around a kidney carries months of feeding across open country. The meat of a reindeer contains lichen, sedge, willow leaf, distance, cold, and time. A predator contains all of that too, but after it has passed through one more gauntlet of expenditure, The world keeps accounts whether anyone writes them down or not. And across deep human time, communities that survive tend to behave as though they understand this, because in effect they do. They follow the thicker channels, they feed where energy gathers in quantity, they learn, step by step, that the great chain of hunger is not democratic. It rewards those who harvest low and punishes those who try to live too high. If the living world were a ladder, it might seem reasonable to climb it in search of richer and richer food. The animals at the top look formidable, concentrated, almost superior. They kill for a living. They carry the drama of the hunt in their muscles. To an observer watching from a distance, a lion appears more potent than a gazelle, a wolf more formidable than a deer, a great predatory fish more impressive than the smaller creatures it pursues through dark water. But nature is not a ladder of increasing reward. It is a narrowing funnel. With every step upward, something is lost, and then lost again. This is the principle modern ecology would later describe in careful terms, sometimes summarized by a deceptively simple rule: only a small fraction of energy passes from one level of the food chain to the next. The phrase is modern, the consequences are ancient. The number often used is 10%, though the real figure varies by ecosystem, species, climate, and circumstance. It is a rule of thumb, not a sacred constant. Scholars still debate the precise efficiency of different systems, especially when comparing oceans, forests, wetlands, and grasslands, or when considering specific animals with unusual life histories. But the broad picture remains remarkably consistent. Most of the energy captured at one level does not become edible tissue available to the level above. It is spent. It disappears into metabolism, movement, heat, waste, failed growth, stress, reproduction, and simple survival. A grazer may consume a great deal of plant matter, yet only a fraction becomes flesh. A predator may consume many grazers, yet only a fraction of their stored energy becomes the predator's flesh in turn. By the time one imagines eating the predator, one is dealing with what remains after multiple stages of expenditure have already taken their share. This is why the 10% rule, even as a simplification, has such explanatory power. It describes the hidden thinning of the stream. If plants in a landscape capture a certain amount of usable energy, herbivores can only transform a portion of that into their own bodies. Carnivores feeding on those herbivores can only transform a portion again. Top predators often stand on a vanishingly small fraction of the original productive base. This does not make them unimportant. Ecologically, they can be critical, shaping prey behavior, controlling populations, and altering entire habitats through the pressure of fear as much as the act of killing. But from the standpoint of feeding humans, the implication is blunt. A large predator is built from an enormous quantity of prior life already spent. It helps to picture the process not as a neat diagram, but as a long series of burnings. Sunlight enters the leaf feeds the herbivore walks, runs, sleeps, digests, shivers, breeds, lactates, escapes, heals, and eventually dies. A predator catches it and gains some of that stored matter, but not all. Much of the prey is lost in the act itself. Parts are inedible, parts are inaccessible, parts are left to scavengers. Then the predator uses what it gained to patrol territory, pursue more prey, compete with rivals, survive infection, endure harsh weather, nourish young, and maintain the specialized body that makes predation possible. Everything along the way consumes fuel. Nothing stores perfectly. Life leaks constantly. To prehistoric humans, the exact percentages would have meant nothing. but the asymmetry would have meant everything. A group does not need equations to notice that a valley can support many deer and only a few wolves. It does not need a textbook to discover that one large herbivore may produce a tremendous amount of food: fat, bone grease, hide, sinew, and tools, while one large predator produces far less than its reputation suggests. The record of human subsistence is filled with these tacit recognitions. People return to herd routes, fish runs, shellfish beds, and bird colonies. They build systems around recurring abundance. They do not, in most environments, organize life around stalking the animals that live by stalking others. No single explanation fully accounts for this pattern, because technology, terrain, and culture all complicate it. But the energetic logic is one of the deepest foundations beneath it. A top predator is therefore not just another kind of meat. It is expensive meat in the strict ecological sense. To produce one adult lion, leopard, wolf, bear, or eagle-sized hunter requires a broad base of lower-level productivity. That productivity must first sustain many prey animals, and those prey animals must first feed on even broader reservoirs of plant or lower trophic production. The predator is the narrow tip of a very wide structure. When humans choose to feed themselves by harvesting that tip, they are selecting from the most expensive portion of the system. It is a poor bargain unless other factors intervene. The irony is that people are often seduced by concentration. A predator looks like condensed power. Its body is all motion and weaponry. It appears to be a distilled form of the hunt itself, as though by eating the hunter one might claim the finest essence of the landscape. That symbolic attraction is real, and it helps explain why predator consumption sometimes appears in ritual or prestige contexts. Yet the energetic reality cuts the other way. The body of the predator is not concentrated abundance. It is concentrated scarcity. It looks powerful because it must compete fiercely over limited returns. Its rarity is not accidental. It is the inevitable consequence of the losses below it. Even within predator populations, that scarcity shapes behavior. Large carnivores often roam enormous territories because prey density cannot support them in tight clusters. They may spend long periods without a major kill. They may fail repeatedly before succeeding. They may steal from one another, scavenge, fast, risk injury, or lose young when prey collapses. All of this tells the same story. The animals at the top are not living in a realm of surplus. They are surviving in a realm of tight margins hidden behind dramatic violence. Human observers who learn to read landscapes would have noticed the signs. Where top predators are healthy, prey must exist in substantial numbers, but the predators themselves remain comparatively few, widely distributed, and hard to turn into regular food. There is another consequence to the 10% rule that matters just as much: numbers. A landscape rich enough to support thousands of herbivores may support only dozens of large carnivores. That means that even if humans were willing to hunt predators often, there would simply not be enough of them to sustain large groups for long. A band, village, or larger society requires repeated access to calories, not occasional spectacle. Herbivores provide scale. Predators rarely do. What survives in the archaeological record again and again is not merely the hunting of animals, but the hunting of populations dense enough to matter. Reindeer migrations, bison jumps, gazelle drives, waterfowl harvests, salmon runs, seal rookeries, and later domestic herds all fit this logic. They are abundant enough to support strategy, storage, and continuity. The wolf pack in the hills is not. This becomes even clearer when one compares what each carcass represents in terms of underlying land use. To sustain one grazer, a tract of vegetation must produce enough energy to keep that grazer alive. To sustain one predator, the land must first support multiple grazers, many of which will never be turned into predator flesh because they die in other ways, escape, age out, or are consumed by others. Then only a fraction of what the predator kills becomes the predator's body. Then only a fraction of that body is available to the human hunter. The losses stack relentlessly. In effect, eating a top predator means drawing calories from the most thinned-out portion of a large ecological budget. None of this means predators are never eaten, or that human beings always make economically perfect choices. They do not. People are cultural creatures as much as biological ones. They eat to survive, but also to celebrate, signal rank, obey taboo, express identity, mark danger overcome, or endure crisis. Sometimes a predator is eaten because it has been killed in defense of the camp. Sometimes it is consumed because famine narrows the range of choices. Sometimes a hunting society values the act enough to justify the low return. Sometimes a coastal or riverine environment produces predatory species in ways that complicate the familiar pattern. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, and the exact motivations are not always recoverable. But even allowing for exceptions, the rule keeps reasserting itself. Top-level flesh is not where stable human subsistence usually settles. It is worth pausing on how profound that truth is. Human beings imagine themselves as breakers of limits. In many ways they are. They cross seas, mine mountains, irrigate deserts, and eventually build industrial systems capable of feeding millions who never see the landscapes that sustain them. Yet the 10% rule remains there beneath the machinery, one of the old constraints never fully removed. It explains why feeding grain to livestock is costly. It explains why diets based heavily on high-level animal consumption require large resource inputs. It explains why agricultural civilizations lean so heavily on plants and herbivores, and why the dream of abundance from top predators is usually ecologically hollow. Modern supply chains can obscure the pattern, but they do not erase it. For ancient humans, however, the pattern would have been brutally direct. They lived closer to the leakage. A failed hunt cost real strength. An unnecessary wound could mean death. A day spent tracking a dangerous carnivore that yielded too little meat was not simply inefficient in an abstract sense. It threatened the delicate balance of survival. Over generations, communities that learned where energy pooled most generously would have fared better than those seduced by rare and costly prey. The lesson did not need to be consciously articulated in universal terms. It only needed to be lived often enough. Follow the thick flows. Do not build your future on the narrow edge of the pyramid. This is why the 10% rule, simple though it is, becomes a key to understanding not just ecology, but human history. It helps explain why cattle matter more than wolves, why deer matter more than leopards, why grazing plains become magnets for human movement, why domestication favors certain animals over others, and why entire cuisines and empires lean on species far less glamorous than the predators that dominate myth. The world of food is not arranged according to ore. It is arranged according to transfer, loss, and return. In the end, the rule reveals something quietly sobering. Every predator carries inside it the memory of immense prior consumption. Its body is a record of many smaller deaths and many stages of energy already spent. To look at such an animal and see only power is to miss half the truth. It is also fragility. It is also inefficiency. It is also a living sign that the available stream has become very thin. Human beings, for all their brilliance, remain answerable to that thinning. They may choose danger for glory, kill a predator for protection, or eat one for ritual or necessity. But when they need dependable nourishment, they almost always turn back toward the broader levels below, where sunlight still survives in greater quantity and the arithmetic of life has not yet narrowed so sharply against them. Once the logic of energy begins to come into focus, the great preference that runs through human history stops looking like habit and starts looking like necessity. Civilizations are not built on whatever animals seem most formidable. They are built on the animals that make the best bargain with sunlight, again and again, whether in open grasslands, wooded steppe, mountain valleys, or river-fed plains. Human communities lean toward creatures that feed low and store well. The dominant meat animals of history are usually not hunters but grazers and browsers. They are cattle, sheep, goats, deer, antelope, horses in some contexts, camels, yaks, reindeer, and a long list of regionally important herbivores and near herbivores that do the same essential work. They eat what people mostly cannot and convert it into a dense, transportable reserve of calories. That transformation is one of the quiet miracles beneath human settlement. A grazing animal is, in ecological terms, an interpreter. It stands between the inedible abundance of the landscape and the limited digestive abilities of the human body. Grass may cover whole horizons, but a person cannot live by chewing dry cellulose on the move. A cow can, a bison can, a gazelle can. A sheep can survive where the ground seems to offer almost nothing but rough stems, hard seeds, sparse leaves, and scrub. Over time, through the labor of digestion, these animals gather the scattered productivity of a habitat into forms humans value: muscle, marrow, tallow, liver, blood, milk in domestic species, and eventually the countless secondary products that become just as important as meat. Hides turn into shelter and clothing, bones become tools, sinews become thread and cord, horn and antler become handles, hooks, points, ornaments, and ritual objects. Dung becomes fuel where forests are scarce. Very often, the herbivore feeds people twice, once as food and again as material culture. This helps explain why the history of human subsistence is so often a history of following herds. The archaeological record of many prehistoric societies reveals repeated attention to animals that move in groups, migrate predictably, gather at water, carve in known seasons, or become vulnerable at certain choke points in the terrain. That predictability matters almost as much as the calories themselves. A top predator may be impressive, but its movements are scattered, its numbers limited, and its availability erratic. A herd animal, by contrast, offers patterns that can be learned and exploited. It can be anticipated. It can be ambushed in numbers. It can be driven, trapped, surrounded, funneled, or waited for. In some environments, whole seasonal calendars begin to revolve around these movements. Camps are placed where animals cross rivers. Tools are made for the exact kind of kill expected. Storage technologies evolve because large returns arrive in bursts and must be preserved. There is also the matter of fat, which history and archaeology often force back into view after modern readers forget how important it is. Lean meat alone is not enough for long-term survival. Human beings need energy-dense foods, and in many hunting societies the richest reward from large herbivores is not the flesh in the abstract, but the combination of fat, marrow, organs, brain tissue, and grease that can sustain people through cold seasons and hard stretches. Scholars still debate the exact nutritional balance in some prehistoric diets, and preservation biases mean the record never tells the whole story. but what survives strongly suggests that hunters prized animals offering high total return, not simply any meat at all. Large herbivores, especially when taken at the right season, can provide a immense nutritional value beyond the red muscle that catches the eye first. Predators often compare poorly here. They may be leaner, riskier, and less reliable sources of the dense energy that small groups desperately need. The scale of the difference becomes even more striking when one imagines not a single kill, but a society trying to endure year after year. A few successful predator hunts might produce memorable stories, but stories are not systems. Human life requires repetition. It requires food sources that can be tapped again and again without impossible effort. A valley holding browsing deer, grazing antelope, and wild cattle is not merely a hunting ground. It is a continuing relationship between people and a landscape that renews usable flesh through plant growth. The human group learns when the animals fatten, where they shelter in bad weather, when the males are exhausted by rut, where the females gather with young, where snow slows movement, where heat forces them toward water. Over generations, such knowledge becomes inheritance. Children grow into a world already mapped by the feeding patterns of herbivores. This is why so many of humanity's most consequential economic transitions are really transitions in how communities access low trophic abundance. Hunting large herbivores more efficiently changes mobility, group size, tool design, and storage possibilities. Managing wild herds shades into herding. Herding becomes domestication. Domestication becomes pastoral wealth. Agriculture complements or feeds domestic herbivores and locks human populations even more tightly into the mathematics of broad-based productivity. Grain feeds sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and sometimes horses. Crop residues feed animals. Animals fertilize fields. Milk stretches calories across seasons. Herds become units of value, dowry, tax, tribute, sacrifice, and state power. None of this develops around wolves or lions. The world that feeds civilizations is a world organized around creatures that make efficient use of lower-level productivity. The preference is not only a matter of abundance and fat, it is also a matter of temperament and tractability, though these matter more strongly later with domestication. Herbivores are not universally docile, far from it. But many herd animals share social structures and feeding behaviors that make them more manageable, predictable, or at least more harvestable than solitary large carnivores. They gather. They flee together. They use established routes. Some can be enclosed. Some can be bred selectively. Some tolerate proximity better than predators do. Others cannot be domesticated successfully, yet still remain worthwhile prey because their ecological role creates density. The evidence remains incomplete for many early transitions, and no single explanation fully accounts for domestication outcomes in every region. But the broad pattern is unmistakable. Human beings repeatedly anchor themselves to animals that can scale. The word scale matters because it separates subsistence from spectacle. A single leopard may be feared by an entire village, yet it cannot feed that village for long. A herd of goats can... A pride of lions may dominate a territory symbolically, but a field system linked to sheep and cattle can sustain thousands of people, year after year, across generations. This is the difference between power that impresses the imagination and power that supports life. Human history depends far more on the second kind. The creatures that nourish societies are often less dramatic than the creatures that dominate folklore, but they are more important in every material sense. A bull does not need to look mythic to change the destiny of a settlement. It only needs to convert grass into food more effectively than a predator can convert prey into itself. There is something almost humbling in this. For all the grandeur of human narratives about conquest, mastery, and exceptionalism, the actual basis of long survival is often simple ecological patience. Find the animals that turn useless abundance into edible abundance. Learn their seasons, learn their weaknesses, learn how to preserve what they give. Everything else follows. Settlement, trade, migration routes, ritual calendars, warfare over pasture, social rank measured in livestock, and later imperial wealth rooted in grain and herd animals all emerge from this underlying preference. Even fishing societies, forest foragers, and mixed subsistence peoples tend to rely heavily on the same principle when one looks closely. They gather most intensely where energy collects thickly enough to support recurring harvest. This is why herbivores, not predators, become the ordinary meat of history. They are not merely easier to eat. They are ecologically designed to be the great converters on which other forms of life can depend. In a dry steppe, they turn grass into travelable nutrition. In uplands, they turn scrub and alpine vegetation into winter stores. In colder regions, reindeer and caribou turn sparse seasonal growth into migration-sized opportunities for human hunters. In pastoral systems, sheep and goats turn marginal land into milk, fleece, meat, and manure. Even animals that complicate the category, such as pigs, still fit the broader human preference for species that can be raised, fattened, or harvested in bulk more efficiently than true top predators. The deep history of this preference is written not just in bones but in landscapes. Prairie fires set intentionally or accidentally may improve grazing and attract game. Forest edges are maintained because browsing animals prefer them. River crossings become repeated hunting grounds. Salt licks become sacred and strategic places. Wells, corrals, enclosures, and later fences all grow from the effort to control or predict animals that feed low and return much. Once humans settle fully into farming and pastoralism, the pattern becomes even harder to miss. They are not surrounding themselves with predators as staple biomass. They are surrounding themselves with converters animals that take sunlight stored in grasses, grains, leaves, and waste products and turn it into food dense enough for human use. Predators still matter enormously in such worlds, but in a different register. They remain threats, symbols, competitors, occasional scavengers, and sometimes a source of fur, prestige, or defensive action. Their presence shapes shepherding practices, weapon ownership, settlement design, and folklore. Yet precisely because they stand outside the stable productive loop, they are handled as disruptions, not foundations. A wolf taking sheep is not just stealing meat. It is stealing converted sunlight that humans have already invested labor into preserving. The outrage many societies feel toward predators becomes more understandable in this light. The predator is not merely dangerous. It is attacking the very mechanism by which people have learned to feed themselves efficiently. In the end, the triumph of herbivores in human food history is not mysterious at all. It is the natural result of living in a world where energy widens at the base and thins toward the top. The animals that best support human life are the ones positioned to intercept broad flows of productivity before too much is lost. They are the ones that can gather scattered plant energy across wide spaces and concentrate it in bodies large enough, fatty enough, numerous enough, and predictable enough to matter. They are, in a sense, the true engines beneath the feast. Human beings may celebrate hunters, paint predators on cave walls, and fill legend with fangs and claws. But when the question turns from awe to survival, they keep returning to the same answer. The animals that feed civilizations are usually the animals that feed on the world most directly. Long before anyone measures calories, draws food pyramids, or gives this pattern a name, human beings begin learning it in the oldest way possible by paying for mistakes with time, exhaustion, and sometimes blood. That lesson is rarely dramatic in the way later myths prefer. It does not arrive as a revelation beside a fire. It accumulates. A hunt goes well in one season because the animals are fat and moving predictably. Another goes badly because the chosen quarry is too scattered, too lean, too dangerous, or too difficult to reach before darkness. One valley proves generous year after year. Another offers excitement, but not enough food. The body remembers these outcomes even when no one speaks of them in abstract terms. And over many generations, what emerges is a practical intelligence so deep it can look like instinct. Humans learn the math without ever writing it down. This kind of learning is easy to underestimate because modern people often imagine knowledge as something formal, explicit, and neatly stored in words. But for most of human history, the most important knowledge is embodied, local, seasonal, and tested constantly against reality. It lives in the pace of a walk, in the timing of a departure, in the choice to wait beside a crossing instead of climbing into dangerous ground after an uncertain target. It lives in the decision to follow the herd rather than the hunter that shadows the herd. What survives in the ethnographic and archaeological record suggests that foraging peoples often possess extraordinarily refined ecological judgment. They know what fattens when. They know how weather alters animal movement. They know where kills are likely to be made by predators and when scavenging may pay. They know the difference between an animal that looks impressive and one that can actually support a family. That judgment is not only about finding food, it is about comparing returns. Every hunt is an investment. It costs movement, attention, time, weapon wear, risk of injury, and often the opportunity to do something else. A group choosing to pursue one target is choosing not to pursue another. In harsh environments especially, those trade-offs become unforgiving. A hunter who spends a day tracking a large carnivore may return with nothing at all. A hunter who intercepts deer at a narrow pass may return with meat, hides, marrow, and enough confidence to repeat the strategy. The evidence remains incomplete because behavior does not fossilize neatly. Yet the repeated patterns in kill sites, tool use, seasonal camps, and faunal remains point toward a consistent preference for prey that offers strong returns relative to effort. Humans do not always choose perfectly, but across long spans of time they learn what usually pays. One can imagine this learning in almost any prehistoric landscape. In open country, herbivores leave the kind of signs that invite pattern recognition, repeated tracks, cropped grass, dung, migration corridors, bedding grounds, routes to water. They gather in visible numbers and often behave collectively. Their vulnerabilities are therefore legible. Hunters can study wind, terrain, and timing. They can plan drives, ambushes, persistence hunts, surround tactics, or traps. By contrast, many predators are solitary or move in smaller groups, roam widely, hide well, and become cautious precisely because they are hunters themselves. They are not only fewer in number, they are harder to predict as food. A creature that survives by reading danger is not easy prey for another reader of danger. This matters because the human advantage in hunting does not eliminate cost, it manages cost. Spears, atlatls, bows, dogs, fire drives, nets, deadfalls, pits, and coordinated group movement all improve the odds, but they do not make every quarry equal. A well-made weapon used against the wrong target still yields poor returns. Scholars still debate the exact timing and prevalence of some hunting methods in different regions, and no single model explains all human prey choice in deep prehistory. But no model needs to. The basic structure is clear enough. Humans become successful not by hunting whatever is fiercest, but by repeatedly aligning technique with favourable energy economics. Intelligence sharpens selection. It does not cancel the need for it. There is also the educational force of failure, which rarely leaves direct traces yet may shape subsistence as strongly as success. A dangerous predator hunt gone wrong teaches a lesson to everyone who hears the story afterward. Even a successful kill may teach the same lesson if the carcass proves lean, damaged, or disappointing compared with the risk involved. One bear that nearly kills 2 hunters and feeds the group only briefly is not just an event. It is data. One season spent targeting more abundant grazers and coming through winter is also data. Human societies do not need spreadsheets to perform this accounting. Memory, reputation, and repeated comparison do the work. Over time, good returns become custom, and custom begins to feel like common sense. This is part of what makes human foraging so impressive. It is not random opportunism, it is often a highly selective, ecologically literate mode of living shaped by subtle optimization. People may appear to be simply hunting animals, but in reality they are making judgments about population density, fat content, migration timing, butchery value, transport cost, preservation potential, danger, and social coordination. The preferred animals of many societies are not chosen because they are symbolically humble or aesthetically unremarkable. They are chosen because they sit at the intersection of abundance and usefulness. A reindeer is not merely meat, it is movement made harvestable. A bison is not merely a large animal, it is an enormous package of calories and materials tied to predictable geography. A seal haul-out, a salmon run, a shellfish bed, a flocking bird colony, a herd crossing a river, all are places where the arithmetic suddenly favours the human hunter. Against that background, predators look different. They are often educational in another sense. By watching them, humans may learn where prey is concentrated, where carcasses lie, how seasons affect movement, and how the broader ecosystem is functioning. Wolves, lions, hyenas, eagles, and big cats are not useless to human subsistence. They are often rich in information. They point toward the thicker flows of life beneath them. Sometimes they even provide access indirectly, by leaving remains behind. Scavenging from predator kills likely mattered more in some periods than older assumptions once allowed, especially where early humans competed within carnivore-rich landscapes. But even there, the lesson is revealing. The real value still lies not in the predator's own body, but in the prey body it has already located and partly processed. This practical intelligence likely accumulates through conversation, imitation, and habit. Children watch adults discuss spoor, weather, and animal condition. They learn which carcasses are celebrated and which are merely endured. They hear which hunts are praised for courage and which for wisdom. These are not always the same thing. Courage may attach to facing a lion, but wisdom may attach to bringing down a fat ungulate with minimal injury. Over time, prestige itself may split. Some societies honour dangerous hunting feats while still feeding most people on safer, richer prey. That split matters. It helps explain why predators can loom so large in story while remaining marginal in everyday diet. Cultural importance is not always dietary importance. The evidence from many times and places suggests that communities understand this perfectly well, even when outsiders later romanticize the more dramatic half of the picture. There is a deeper point hidden here. Humans do not merely adapt to ecosystems, they become experts at locating where ecosystems are most economically vulnerable to human skill. That is a different kind of predation than what most large carnivores practice. A wolf may chase the weak, the old, the young, or the isolated. A human group may alter terrain with fire, coordinate from a distance, store surplus, return seasonally, and teach across generations. In that sense, human hunting success comes less from raw physical superiority than from cumulative ecological accounting. People become dangerous because they know where effort turns most efficiently into food, and once that knowledge deepens, the choice to avoid relying on predators as staple meat is not timid, it is rational. This rationality can be so effective that it reshapes landscapes. If a community concentrates on highly profitable prey, it may move camp systems, seasonal routes, and tool traditions around those animals. It may schedule marriages, gatherings, and trade around harvest peaks. It may develop preservation methods for exactly the kinds of returns those animals provide. In some places it may overhunt or alter prey behavior profoundly, showing that humans are not always wise stewards. Yet even overexploitation reveals the same pattern. People pressure what matters most to subsistence, and what matters most is usually what offers dense, recurring returns from lower trophic levels. They do not transform their world around the pursuit of rare top predators because rare top predators do not support transformation at scale. No single explanation fully accounts for every prey choice, and there are always exceptions shaped by climate, ritual, competition, or necessity. Some environments constrain options so tightly that people must take whatever they can get. Some predator species are more worthwhile than others under particular conditions. Some groups may value the social meaning of dangerous hunts enough to accept lower energetic returns. But the broad arc remains. Across deep time, humans repeatedly learn that the smartest hunt is often not the most dramatic hunt. It is the one that brings back enough food to matter, with risk low enough to repeat, from animals numerous enough to support the attempt. In that sense, prehistoric people are constantly performing a form of field-tested ecological reasoning. They may never state the 10% rule, but they live inside its consequences. They know that landscapes do not offer equal choices. They know that some bodies carry more of the land inside them than others. They know that a successful camp depends less on proving bravery against the fiercest animal than on finding the richest current of energy and stepping into it at the right moment. The math becomes culture because culture is how repeated success is remembered. And so the preference for herbivores, schooling fish, flocking birds, dense shellfish beds, and other high-return resources is not an accident of taste. It is the result of long apprenticeship to the world. Humans watch, fail, succeed, compare, remember, and teach. Out of that process comes a subsistence logic so robust that later science will only formalize what countless generations already practiced. The animals worth building life around are usually the ones that gather energy broadly and visibly enough for humans to intercept. The predators remain at the edge of that knowledge, important but secondary, feared but seldom foundational. The ancient hunter learns the same lesson the ecologist will one day describe in charts. Go where the flow is thickest. Let the dangerous specialist keep the thin upper stream. There is a second lesson hidden inside the first, and ancient humans would have learned it just as clearly, though perhaps with more scars. Even if predators had offered better calories than they usually do, they would still have come with a different kind of cost. one that cannot be measured only in meat weight or chase distance. A predator does not merely exist as food waiting to be taken. It is an animal already adapted to violence, already built to resist capture, already armed in ways that make every close encounter unstable. Teeth, claws, speed, crushing force, ambush tactics, territorial aggression, and the simple refusal to die quietly all mean that turning a predator into prey can become one of the most expensive bargains in the natural world. It is not just that the return is often small, it is that the path to the return is unusually dangerous. This is where the human tendency to admire courage can blur practical reality. From the standpoint of story, killing a predator looks like the height of prowess. It means facing something feared. It means entering into direct conflict with an animal that itself lives by killing. In later societies, and likely in many earlier ones as well, such acts can become symbols of masculinity, prestige, defense, or supernatural power. A lion killer is remembered. A bear slain near camp becomes part of collective memory. A wolf pack driven off from livestock may define a winter in the minds of those who survive it, but admiration is not the same thing as efficiency. The hunt that yields the greatest story is often not the hunt that best feeds children, conserves strength, or minimizes crippling injury. What survives in the record suggests that human communities are usually sharper judges of this distinction than later romantic accounts allow. Consider the simple mechanics of risk. A large herbivore can certainly kill a hunter. Many have. Yet most large herbivores are not purpose-built for offensive violence against human beings, in the way a large carnivore or defensive omnivore often is. They may flee first, charge under pressure, gore when cornered, trample when panicked. A predator, by contrast, is often practiced in reading motion, seizing openings, targeting weakness, and fighting through resistance. Even wounded, it remains dangerous in a specialized way. A boar may be fearsome, but a big cat striking from concealment, or a bear turning at close range, or a wolf pack in difficult terrain presents a different class of problem. The energy cost of the hunt is therefore joined by the risk cost of the encounter, and risk has its own arithmetic. A broken arm, torn leg, infected wound, or blinded eye can erase any nutritional gain many times over. This is especially important in small-scale societies where labour is precious and medical recovery is uncertain. An injured hunter is not just one person in pain. He is less mobility for the group, less future hunting ability, more need for care, greater strain on others, and sometimes the loss of knowledge that cannot easily be replaced. In harsh environments, even relatively modest injuries can become life-threatening once infection, cold, or immobility set in. Scholars still debate how much care injured individuals received in different prehistoric societies. Though some archaeological finds suggest impressive levels of long-term support, but support itself is costly. It depends on surplus and cohesion. From a subsistence standpoint, this means that prey choice cannot be separated from injury management. Animals that impose high odds of catastrophic harm are poor routine food sources even before one measures their caloric return. Predator hunting therefore often carries a cruel asymmetry. The quarry is dangerous precisely because its body is optimized for violent encounters. But that same optimization does not necessarily translate into a large edible reward. A lion is powerful, but much of that power is embodied in muscle, tendon, bone, reflex, and maintenance costs rather than in broad stores of fat. A wolf is formidable in a pack, but individually it does not represent a great mass of food. A leopard or tiger may inspire fear far beyond its actual value as meat. A bear is more complicated, and in some regions more worthwhile, yet even then the hazards of close pursuit, uncertain fat levels, and seasonal variation matter greatly. No single explanation fully accounts for every decision to hunt or avoid such animals, because local traditions and circumstances differ. Still, the broad pattern remains striking. Dangerous prey needs to offer extraordinary return before it becomes sensible, and most predators do not. There is also the problem of pursuit itself. Many herbivores, especially herd animals, can be hunted with tactics that reduce direct confrontation. They can be driven toward cliffs, bottlenecks, or enclosures. They can be intercepted at crossings. They can be targeted when exhausted by migration, deep snow, drought concentration, rutting distraction, or restricted escape routes. Human intelligence thrives under such conditions because planning multiplies force. With predators, those advantages often narrow. Solitary carnivores move more unpredictably, use concealment, operate over large territories, and may detect danger quickly, because noticing danger is part of how they survive. Packs are not necessarily easier. They may simply mean several dangerous bodies instead of one. Even locating the animal consistently may cost more than the eventual carcass justifies. This is why defensive killing and food hunting are not the same category, even when the same animal is involved. Humans have long killed predators to protect themselves, their camps, their children, their dogs, and later their livestock. Such killings may be necessary. They may even be frequent in some frontiers. But necessity does not automatically turn the dead animal into desirable staple food. Sometimes it is eaten to avoid waste. Sometimes it is avoided for cultural reasons. Sometimes only parts are taken. Sometimes the carcass serves more as proof, trophy, or warning than as meal. The distinction is revealing. A society may be deeply committed to removing dangerous predators from its surroundings, while still showing little interest in relying on their flesh. The motive is security, not nourishment. The deeper one looks, the more this becomes a story about predictability. Human subsistence depends on repeated success. If a prey species cannot be hunted with a reasonably stable balance of danger and return, it remains marginal no matter how impressive it appears. Top predators fail this test in most environments. They are scarce, hazardous, hard to find, difficult to handle once wounded, and often less generous in calories than their threat suggests. A hunter may win once and gain prestige. He may even win several times. But a community cannot sensibly build regular food strategies around contests whose failure rate is costly and whose success rate still yields modest food compared with more profitable alternatives. There is a revealing contrast here with how humans often use dangerous animals symbolically. The very fact that a predator is risky can make it valuable in ritual or status terms. Bringing down a leopard, bear, lion, or eagle may prove courage, divine favor, adulthood, leadership, or protective strength. The pelt, claws, skull, or teeth may outlast the meat in cultural importance. In some places, the act itself matters more than consumption. This is one reason predators can seem more central to human life than their nutritional role would justify. They occupy the world of meaning very strongly, but meaning can disguise material truth. An animal may be culturally enormous and economically minor at the same time. What survives in the ethnographic record often hints at this duality. Communities that regularly fear predators may still invest relatively little of their actual subsistence effort in hunting them unless circumstances force the issue. When they do hunt them, it may be for protection, retaliation, ceremonial necessity, or the prestige of proving mastery over danger. Food is present, but not always primary. Scholars still debate the exact blend of motives in many cases, especially where oral traditions, colonial observations, and archaeological remains only partially overlap. Yet the recurring pattern is hard to miss. The dangerous hunt exists, but it exists on the margins of the dependable diet. It is an event, not a base. There is also the matter of carcass handling. A large herbivore kill is difficult enough, but it often rewards effort at every stage of butchery. Several people can work a carcass, transport useful portions, render fat, crack bones, dry strips, and distribute shares. The returns justify organized labor. A dangerous predator kill may demand equal or greater caution and labor while providing much less to process. Worse still, the risk does not end at death. A wounded predator can surge unexpectedly. Other scavengers may arrive quickly to contested carcasses. The psychological tension of such encounters is not trivial. Fear itself has a cost. A group that can secure the same or better nourishment from less volatile prey does not need much encouragement to prefer the calmer option. In this sense, the ancient human avoidance of predators as ordinary food is not squeamishness or superstition. It is a disciplined reading of consequences. Communities that live close to subsistence margins cannot afford to confuse bravery with prudence too often. They may celebrate bravery, they may need it, but they survive on prudence. They learn to distinguish between prey worth risking much for and prey worth letting, remain part of the landscape's upper drama. The predator becomes something to watch, outwit, imitate in certain skills, fear in certain places, and remove when necessary, but not usually something to chase as a routine source of meat. This helps explain why some of the most efficient human hunting systems look, on the surface, less heroic than popular imagination expects. Waiting near a crossing, coordinating a drive, exploiting seasonal concentration, setting traps, or taking advantage of herd behavior lacks the theatrical danger of confronting a great carnivore. Yet these quieter methods are exactly what allow human groups to feed themselves reliably. They convert knowledge into return while minimizing unnecessary injury. They are the practices of a species that survives not by proving itself against the most dangerous animal every day, but by understanding where danger is needless and where it is not. And so the predator remains slightly apart. It may enter the human story with a rush of adrenaline, a sudden charge, a night attack at the edge of camp, a ceremonial hunt, or a defensive strike in bad weather. It may leave behind songs, scars, ornaments, and warnings. But when the smoke rises from regular meals and the hard business of endurance resumes, human beings usually turn back toward the less glamorous creatures that can be killed more safely, more often, and with far better return. The dangerous hunter of the wild has its place in the human imagination. As ordinary food, that place is usually small. The math of energy began the lesson. The math of injury finishes it. Even when the danger is survived and the hunt succeeds, another problem remains waiting in the carcass itself. A predator is often a disappointing answer to hunger, not only because it is hard to kill, but because it is built differently from the animals humans most value as food. The body of a hunter is designed for pursuit, acceleration, balance, sudden violence, and long intervals between uncertain meals. That design has consequences. Many predators are relatively lean when compared with the fat-bearing herbivores and omnivores that have fed human populations most reliably. Their flesh can be dense, stringy, and protein-rich without offering the same depth of usable energy. To a hungry group living close to the edge, That distinction matters more than modern habits sometimes allow. The crucial issue is not simply meat, but what kind of meat and what comes with it. Human beings need calories, and calories are not distributed evenly through animal bodies. Fat carries far more energy than protein, and in many traditional hunting societies it is prized accordingly. Marrow, rendered grease, organ fat, back fat, tail fat in certain species, and the rich deposits laid down before winter or after good grazing are all forms of concentrated security. They support cold weather survival, child growth, recovery from hard travel, and the long intervals when no successful hunt arrives. Lean flesh alone cannot do all of this. In fact, there are limits to how much benefit humans can get from a diet overloaded with very lean protein and too little fat or carbohydrate. The evidence remains incomplete in some historical and prehistoric settings, and diets were always mixed rather than simple. But what survives in the ethnographic and physiological record strongly suggests that hunters often cared less about meat in the abstract than about energy-dense meat and everything associated with it. Large herbivores can provide exactly that when conditions are right. A well-fed ungulate near the end of a productive season can carry impressive reserves. Even when the muscle is not especially fatty, the carcass may still yield marrow-rich bones, nourishing organs, brain tissue, and deposits around the kidneys and viscera that matter enormously in a subsistence context. Some animals are famous in hunting traditions for these qualities. Others vary sharply by season, age, sex, and habitat, which means good hunters do not just identify species, they identify profitable individuals and profitable times to strike. The body of a grazer is often a landscape surplus made tangible. It stores good months inside itself. When humans kill such an animal, they take possession not merely of flesh but of accumulated abundance. Predators, by contrast, often live too close to the margin to carry much excess. This is one of the strange truths hidden behind their image of strength. A lion can look magnificent and still be running on narrow reserves. A wolf can be powerful yet spare. A big cat, an eagle, even some marine predators, all may be optimized for performance rather than storage. They must stay mobile, fast, and efficient in their own way. They cannot always afford to become heavily laden with fat, and when they do gain fat, that may be seasonal, inconsistent, or hard-won. A predator's life often involves cycles of feast and shortfall, with prolonged expenditure between successful kills. Its body reflects that uncertainty. It is built to survive the hunt, not to serve as a warehouse for another species that might later eat it. This helps explain why the kill that looks dramatic may still yield underwhelming nourishment. A predator carcass can be smaller than expected beneath the skin, narrower in return than the danger of obtaining it suggests. Much of what is there may be muscle adapted for action rather than tissue rich in easily harvested energy. Some species also have strong flavors or textures that later observers remark upon, though taste is culturally variable and rarely decisive by itself. The deeper issue is value for effort. A community that can obtain a large grazing animal loaded with marrow and potentially substantial fat will usually find it hard to justify repeated pursuit of leaner, scarcer, more hazardous prey. The old pattern keeps asserting itself at the level of butchery. There is an especially important physiological edge to this. Hunters living in cold or marginal environments often need high energy density. Protein is essential, but using protein as a major fuel source without enough accompanying fat or carbohydrate places strain on the body. The phrase later popularized as rabbit starvation points toward one version of this problem. though real diets were more complex and scholars still debate how often such extremes occurred in practice. Even so, the principle is clear. Lean meat is not the same as abundant nourishment. A pile of low-fat muscle cannot always substitute for fewer pounds of richer food. This is one reason why small, very lean animals are often less valuable than their simple mass would suggest, and why certain large predators, despite impressive size, compare poorly with fatter herbivores or omnivores. The preference for animals with usable secondary returns deepens the contrast further. A fat ungulate is not only good for immediate eating, it can be rendered. Bone grease can be extracted. Marrow can be stored or consumed quickly. Hides from many herbivores are highly useful. Tendons, stomach contents in some traditions, antler or horn, and large bones all enter practical life. The carcass breaks down into many assets. Predators can offer hides and teeth of great symbolic or practical value, and sometimes bones or sinew as well. But the nutritional side is often less generous relative to risk. In other words, the non-food value of predators may exceed their food value, while with major prey herbivores the two often reinforce each other beautifully. This does not mean every predator is uniformly lean or worthless as meat. Bears complicate the picture immediately. In some seasons and environments, bears can accumulate substantial fat and become much more attractive nutritionally than the typical image of a top predator would suggest. Marine mammals and certain large fish complicate it further. Because aquatic food webs do not map neatly onto familiar land expectations, and some predatory species can carry rich stores of oil or fat. These important exceptions matter, and later parts of the story will return to them. But exceptions do not erase the broader tendency. Across most terrestrial settings, large predators are not the rich, dependable, calorie packages that herd animals often are. What survives in many hunting traditions suggests that people understood these distinctions intimately. They knew which animals looked big but dressed out poorly. They knew which seasons produced firm fat and which left carcasses empty. They knew the bitter disappointment of opening a body that seemed promising and finding too little to sustain the effort spent. Such knowledge is rarely recorded in neat ecological language, but it shapes behavior powerfully. A people living by hunting does not merely ask whether an animal can be eaten. It asks whether that animal is worth becoming the center of a strategy. Many predators fail that test not because they are inedible, but because they are nutritionally narrow compared with more profitable prey. There is also the question of distribution. Herbivores often gather their energy into body mass at scale because they can feed for long hours on abundant low-level resources. A herd animal may represent a great quantity of edible biomass simply because it has access to broad plant productivity over time. Predators, with rarer prey and more uncertain intake, often cannot accumulate such masses cheaply. Even a large predator is, in ecological terms, a costly body. It takes a great deal of underlying life to produce one, yet that body may still deliver less total usable nourishment than a much more common grazer standing in the same landscape. That mismatch is one of the clearest signs that power and food value are not the same thing. The human response to this mismatch is practical. A dangerous animal that also proves lean encourages distance, taboo, or at least indifference as regular prey. Its skin may be prized, its claws worn, its skull displayed, its destruction celebrated, and its behavior carefully studied. But once the butchering is done, the material lesson is hard to ignore. All that hazard, all that skill, all that attention, and the reward is thin. By contrast, a heavy herbivore taken at the right moment can feed many people, generate stores, and provide the kind of surplus from which social life itself becomes easier. One kind of kill creates a story, the other kind helps a winter end. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, because human diets are shaped by terrain, technology, ritual, competition, and chance. Yet the problem of lean flesh and thin rewards keeps appearing beneath the variation. It helps explain why predator consumption remains episodic, opportunistic, or culturally charged rather than ordinary. It helps explain why so many societies cherish fat so intensely, and why their most valued prey are often not the fiercest animals, but the richest ones. The glamour of the predator belongs mostly to the eye and the imagination. The real wealth lies in bodies that have had time and opportunity to store the landscape generously. This is another reason the 10% rule expresses itself so clearly in human food choices. Energy does not just thin out in the chain abstractly. It appears concretely in the feel of a carcass, the shine of fat under skin, the ease of rendering grease from bone, the satisfaction of organs shared around a fire, the strength a group carries into the next day. Ancient hunters did not need laboratory nutrition to understand what fed them well. They had hands, knives, memory, and consequence. They opened animals and learned which ones contained a season's worth of stored sunlight in useful form, and which ones contained mostly the hard machinery of survival. Again and again, the predators fell into the second category. In that sense, human avoidance of predators as staple food is also an avoidance of disappointment. It is a refusal, learned over deep time, to be misled by appearance. The animal that seems most commanding in life may offer very little abundance in death. The quieter grazer, heavy with the work of endless feeding, often gives far more. Between them lies the difference between spectacle and sustenance. Human societies that endure tend to recognize that difference clearly, even if they continue to reserve a special place in memory for the lean, dangerous creatures they wisely choose not to eat very often. By the time a predator reaches the top of a food chain, it carries more than muscle and bone inside its body. It carries accumulation. Not abundance in the generous sense that feeds a village, but accumulation in the darker ecological sense, the gradual concentration of whatever the lower levels of the chain have absorbed, endured, or failed to escape. This is one more reason humans so rarely make predators into ordinary food. Even when a dangerous animal can be killed, even when its flesh can technically be eaten, and even when lean meat is better than no meat at all, there remains a hidden problem that only deep experience could have taught long before chemistry explained it. The higher an animal feeds, the more likely it is to gather the unwanted residues of the world. Some of those residues are alive. Parasites move upward through food webs with grim efficiency. Worms, protozoa, bacteria, and a variety of infectious organisms often find rich opportunity in predators because predators consume many prey and expose themselves to the tissues, blood, and viscera of multiple species. A herbivore may ingest pathogens from soil, water, or plants, but a predator repeatedly takes into its body the biological history of the animals it kills. This does not mean herbivores are clean, and carnivores are uniquely dangerous. Far from it. Any wild animal can carry disease, and human beings have long faced serious risks from the food they hunt, herd, store, and prepare. Scholars still debate the prevalence of certain ancient zoonotic risks because the evidence is fragmentary and uneven. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Predators and scavengers often stand at especially risky intersections of infection. That danger becomes sharper when humans eat such animals casually or prepare them poorly. Trichinella in bears and other carnivorous or omnivorous mammals is one famous example. known in later medical history. But the underlying logic is much older than the diagnosis. Carnivorous mammals that consume infected prey can pass parasites upward. Scavengers feeding on carrion multiply their exposure further. A body that has made its living by tearing open other bodies is, from the standpoint of disease ecology, not a neutral object. It is a crossroads. Ancient people would not have known the names of the organisms involved, but what survives in the record suggests that repeated experience often taught caution long before causes were understood. Certain meats became suspect, certain species were avoided, restricted, or prepared with care. Sometimes the lesson took cultural form as taboo. Sometimes it remained practical knowledge spoken in terms of sickness, danger, or impurity rather than microbes. There is also a second kind of accumulation, less visible, but no less important toxins and contaminants that intensify as they move upward. Modern science has given precise language to this process through ideas like bioaccumulation and biomagnification, especially in aquatic systems where mercury, persistent pollutants, and other harmful compounds can become concentrated in large predatory fish and marine mammals. But the principle is broader than industrial contamination alone. Even in older worlds, natural toxins, plant secondary compounds, environmental poisons, and the chemical burdens of prey could move through bodies unevenly. No single explanation fully accounts for all traditional avoidances of predator meat, because culture is never reducible to chemistry. Yet it is difficult to ignore how often the highest feeders are also the most chemically burdened. Aquatic environments make this especially vivid. A large predatory fish can appear magnificent, rich, and worth catching. Yet in many waters the animals at the top carry the heaviest contaminant loads. Modern advisories about mercury in species such as shark, swordfish, and some large tuna are the clearest public example, and they illustrate the same ecological truth that shaped ancient choices in more intuitive form. The higher one goes, the more unwanted things can collect. Marine ecosystems complicate the story, because some predatory species are still heavily eaten and can be nutritious under the right conditions. The evidence remains incomplete when trying to reconstruct how much ancient coastal peoples recognize these specific dangers as chemical processes, but even without formal science, societies that relied closely on local waters often developed very sharp distinctions between species worth targeting regularly and species approached more selectively. On land, the problem shows itself differently but still powerfully. Carnivores and scavengers may carry pathogens from carrion, from repeated exposure to blood and organs, and from moving across wide territories and prey communities. They may also feed on animals already weakened by disease. In some cases, the predator becomes a kind of filter for the misfortune of the ecosystem, not because it is cursed or unclean in any moral sense, but because its position makes it unusually likely to collect trouble. Hyenas, wild dogs, vultures, and other scavengers or opportunistic hunters reveal this tension especially well. They're often intelligent, ecologically vital, and deeply informative animals to observe. Yet from a human dietary standpoint, they are exactly the sort of creatures one would hesitate to turn into ordinary food unless necessity intervened. This hesitation is not simply fear of contamination in the modern hygienic sense. It is part of a broader historical pattern in which humans distinguish between animals that look like good converters of living landscape and animals that look like concentrated endpoints of blood, decay, and uncertainty. Cultural taboos may exaggerate or reshape these distinctions, and not all taboos arise from empirical health outcomes. Some emerge from symbolic oppositions, social boundaries, or cosmological beliefs that cannot be reduced to utility. Still, Scholars have long noted that taboo and practical risk sometimes overlap in suggestive ways. What a community declares unclean, dangerous, or unfit may occasionally encode old observations about spoilage, sickness, parasites, or poor returns, even if the explanation given is spiritual rather than ecological. The evidence remains incomplete, but the overlap is too recurrent to dismiss entirely. This is one reason predator meat can occupy such an unstable place in human societies. It is not merely scarce or lean or dangerous to obtain, it is often uncertain after death as well. Will it sicken those who eat it? Does it need special treatment? Is it safe for children, elders, or pregnant women? Is it edible in one season and risky in another? Does eating it carry spiritual contamination because the animal itself occupies an ambiguous place between admired force and polluted danger? Questions like these do not arise as strongly around every herbivore, fish, or bird, though any wild food can become hazardous under the wrong conditions. Predators simply invite more suspicion because too many kinds of risk converge in them at once. The human response to converging risks is usually selectivity rather than absolute refusal. That is an important distinction. Many societies do eat some predators, many more do so occasionally, under ritual rules, with careful preparation, or in response to local opportunity. But very few build ordinary subsistence around animals that are simultaneously scarce, dangerous, lean, and biologically loaded with elevated chances of parasites or accumulated toxins. The old ecological arithmetic is joined here by a kind of toxic arithmetic. It is one thing to bring home a carcass that may not feed many people. It is another to bring home one that may also bring sickness. Once again, the cost begins to outweigh the gain. This helps explain why humans so often prefer animals lower on the chain, even when those animals are not entirely safe either. A grazing herbivore may carry pathogens, but it usually lacks the multiplied exposure of a predator feeding on many other bodies. A fish low in the food web may still require care, but it often carries fewer concentrated contaminants than the giant hunter above it. Small schooling fish, shellfish gathered from known waters, or mid-level prey species can offer a far better balance between return and risk than the dramatic apex species that dominate imagination. In this sense, humans do not simply avoid predators because they are hard to catch. They avoid them because predators often represent an ecological bottleneck where danger, inefficiency, and contamination all meet. There is a revealing emotional dimension to this as well. Human beings are not only calculators of calories, they are pattern-seeking creatures attentive to illness, disgust, and memory. One bad outcome can linger in communal knowledge for generations. An animal associated with sickness becomes morally charged very quickly. Once that happens, the animal's position in diet may shrink even further than raw energetic logic would predict. This is one reason dietary patterns are never explained by ecology alone. Culture amplifies experience. It turns isolated warnings into norms, and norms into identity. A species already poor as regular food may be pushed even farther to the edge by the suspicion that it carries hidden dangers inside. Modern science, in many ways, has only confirmed the wisdom behind that caution. Today it is possible to trace contaminant loads through marine systems, identify parasites in muscle tissue, and explain the mechanisms by which toxins magnify upward through trophic levels. But such precision does not overturn the old human pattern, it illuminates it. The people who avoided relying heavily on top predators were not merely conservative or irrational. Very often they were reading the world accurately through consequences, even if they lacked the biochemical vocabulary to describe what they had seen. By the fire, None of this would have been expressed as parasitology or toxicology. It would have been known another way. An animal made people ill. Another seemed to taste wrong in warm weather. Another was said to bring fever unless treated carefully. Another was eaten only by certain people, or only in scarcity, or only after ritual preparation. A great fish from deep water was admired but approached with caution. A bear was valued in one season and avoided in another. A scavenger was almost never worth the risk. Human communities build these distinctions slowly, through observation layered with belief, through trial softened or hardened by memory. The result is not perfect science, but it is often sound survival. So the predator's body becomes, once again, a poor foundation for ordinary nourishment. Too much has already been filtered through it. Too much uncertainty clings to it. It may still be eaten, and sometimes with purpose or even reverence. But as a staple, it remains burdened by what it carries upward from the rest of the world. The great hunter of the landscape is not only the thin upper end of the energy stream. It is also, often, the place where the stream arrives carrying its heaviest residues. For a species trying to survive by choosing wisely, that is reason enough to look lower, and yet the pattern is not absolute. Human beings do sometimes eat predators, and those moments matter precisely because they reveal the boundaries of the rule rather than destroying it. A bear hauled from a winter den, a lion killed after attacking livestock, a crocodile taken from a dangerous river bend, a shark butchered on a coast where little can be wasted, a big cat consumed after a ceremonial hunt, a dog eaten in some societies but treated as kin in others, a fox trapped in hardship, an eagle or other raptor taken under very specific ritual conditions. All of these remind us that humans are too flexible, too local, and too shaped by circumstance to obey any ecological principle in a perfectly mechanical way. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, and the reasons differ greatly from culture to culture, but the exceptions are real. They simply do not become the dominant foundation of ordinary food life. That distinction is crucial. An exception is not a refutation. In fact, it often reveals how strong the underlying rule really is, because predator consumption tends to appear under special conditions. One of those conditions is necessity, a harsh winter, a failed migration, a famine, a siege, a remote hunting camp with limited alternatives, or a landscape where every successful kill must be used can push people toward animals they would not otherwise prefer. In such moments, the question is no longer whether a predator is the best food, it is whether it is food at all, and whether there is enough time, fuel, skill, or desperation to make use of it. Humans, being humans, often answer yes. This says much about their adaptability and very little against the broader ecological logic. Hunger lowers the threshold of acceptability, but it does not change the relative costliness of the meal. Another condition is protection. A predator killed because it threatens camp, herd, children, or dogs may be eaten afterwards simply because waste is foolish. This is especially likely in societies that live too close to subsistence margins to discard edible flesh lightly. Yet here again the motive reveals the pattern. The animal is not hunted primarily because it is valued as staple food. It enters the cooking space secondarily, after a conflict that began for other reasons. The carcass becomes a recovered resource, not the original objective. Such cases are important because they show how human practicality can coexist with a broader reluctance to rely on predator meat. A society may dislike a species, fear it, kill it when forced, and still consume it opportunistically without ever organizing subsistence around it. Ceremony and prestige form another path. Dangerous animals can attract human attention not because they feed well, but because they mean something. To kill a lion, bear, leopard, crocodile, or eagle may prove bravery, mark adulthood, defend communal honor, or demonstrate unusual ability. In such settings, eating the animal may carry symbolic force. The act can become one of incorporation, as though strength is absorbed through consumption, or one of controlled transgression, where a dangerous being is turned into something socially mastered. Anthropologists and historians have long noted that foods of prestige often resist the ordinary logic of efficiency. They are consumed not because they are abundant and practical, but because they are rare and meaningful. Predator meat fits that category better than it fits the category of staple nourishment. Bears are perhaps the clearest terrestrial example of how complicated the exception can become. Bears are not simple apex carnivores in the narrow sense. Many are omnivores, and their diets shift strongly with region and season. In some times and places, especially when they're feeding heavily on nuts, berries, fish, or pre-hibernation fat stores, they can become nutritionally far more worthwhile than the average image of predator meat suggests. This helps explain why bears appear in the food traditions of several northern and forest societies more often than wolves, large cats, or other leaner carnivores do. Even so, the hunt remains dangerous, seasonal, and culturally charged. Bear meat may be valued, but it rarely escapes the aura of special handling. It often comes attached to ritual respect, caution about preparation, or rules about who may eat which parts. The animal is too important, too dangerous, and too symbolically charged to become just another bland unit of meat. Dogs offer a different and revealing kind of exception. Across human history, dogs have moved through roles so varied that no single statement about them can hold everywhere. They have been workers, companions, hunting partners, guards, ritual beings, trade goods, and in some societies, food animals. Their position depends less on ecology alone than on the extraordinary intimacy of the human-dog relationship. When dogs are eaten, it is not usually because they are an efficient trophic solution in the way sheep or pigs are. It is because social boundaries around the species are drawn differently. In some cases, dog consumption may be occasional, ceremonial, or linked to particular contexts rather than everyday staple feeding. The example is important precisely because it shows how strongly culture can override or redirect simple classification. A carnivorous or omnivorous animal may enter diet when social meaning permits it, but that does not make it the best energetic choice. Big cats and wolves tell a harsher story. They are more often feared, killed defensively, or turned into objects of display than integrated into routine food systems. Historical and ethnographic references to their consumption do exist, but they are scattered, contingent, and frequently bound to unusual circumstances. A wolf may be eaten in extremity, a lion may be consumed after a successful communal hunt, leopard or tiger meat may appear in medicinal, symbolic, or prestige contexts. Yet the very irregularity of these examples underlines the point. Such animals do not normally support repeated, scaled subsistence. They remain too sparse, too dangerous, too lean, and too loaded with symbolic ambiguity to become ordinary food for most communities. Crocodiles and large reptiles occupy another interesting edge of the story. In some regions, crocodilian meat is indeed eaten, and in the right settings the animal can provide a meaningful return. But even here the logic of exception often persists. The kill may require specialized knowledge and real danger. The animal may be taken because it threatens waterways or settlements. The meat may be welcome. Yet the species does not usually become the unquestioned backbone of a food economy. It remains part of a mixed and opportunistic strategy rather than the central dependable axis. The same tends to hold for many terrestrial predators more broadly. Humans can and do consume them. They simply return to them irregularly. Scholars still debate how far some of these practices extend into deep prehistory, because bones alone do not always reveal motive clearly. Cut marks show processing, but not whether the animal was hunted for food, killed in defense, scavenged after death, or consumed in ritual settings. Burn marks reveal cooking or disposal, but not always preference. In some cases, the record only hints at what happened. A predator skeleton with butchery marks may reflect hunger, celebration, opportunism, or all three at once. This uncertainty matters. It reminds us not to force all evidence into a single tidy model. Human behavior is never that neat, but uncertainty also does not erase the larger pattern. Even where predator consumption is attested, it usually remains secondary. There is something revealing in the emotional tone of these exceptions. Predator meat often arrives with story already attached. It is the meat of an encounter, a defense, a challenge, a survival episode, a ritual moment, or a culturally marked act. By contrast, the great foundation foods of human history often arrive with far less theatrical weight. They are the deer processed after a successful drive, the sheep from the herd, the goat slaughtered for a feast, the fish taken in numbers, the pig fattened for use, the cattle that anchor wealth and subsistence alike. These foods may also carry ritual meaning, of course, but they do not require exceptionality to justify themselves. They are normal precisely because they work. This difference between normal and exceptional may be the most important clue of all. Humans will eat predators when the surrounding conditions make it sensible enough, necessary enough, or meaningful enough, but they do not usually choose them first, and they almost never build broad, stable food systems around them where other options exist. The exception proves how adaptive humans are. The rule proves how constrained all animals remain by energy, danger, and biology. One can even say that predator eating becomes most common where the act is buffered by something else: ritual respect, a scarcity of alternatives, unusual seasonal fattening, defensive killing, or strong cultural meanings that justify the poor bargain. Strip away those buffers and the old reluctance returns. People prefer the animals that turn the lower levels of the world into accessible abundance. They reserve predators for the edges of life, where necessity, identity, or symbolism become strong enough to outweigh ordinary cost. So these exceptions do not weaken the central story. They give it texture. They show that humans are not robots of efficiency, but neither are they blind to consequence. They can eat the dangerous hunter. They can even honor it by eating it. But most of the time, when survival must be repeated again and again, they choose otherwise. The extraordinary remains extraordinary. The staple remains something humbler, broader, and far more generous in return. And that is why the record of predator consumption, fascinating though it is, reads less like a menu and more like a set of boundary stones marking where the ordinary logic of food begins to bend under pressure from fear, ritual, hardship, and human imagination. The sea complicates everything. On land, the pattern can look almost clean. Plants spread wide. Herbivores gather that abundance into flesh. Predators live on the narrowing upper share, and humans, when they think practically, tend to harvest lower rather than higher. But once the story moves to coasts, estuaries, rivers, kelp forests, and the open ocean, familiar categories begin to blur. People do eat predators from the sea. They eat tuna, cod, salmon in their ocean feeding phases, groupers, barracuda in some places, seals in some regions, and a great range of fish that are themselves hunters. At first glance, this can seem like an exception large enough to break the whole argument. Yet the deeper one looks, the more the old logic survives even here, though in altered form. Marine systems do not abolish the rule. They hide it inside more complex food webs. The first reason is simple. The sea is extraordinarily productive in some places, and much of that productivity begins at scales almost too small to see. Phytoplankton, algae, and other minute life forms capture energy rapidly and feed immense chains of consumption. In coastal upwellings, estuaries rich in nutrients, cold currents, and kelp-dominated waters, the base of the system can be so vast and so constantly renewed that large numbers of fish and marine mammals become possible. But the same truth still applies. Every step upward narrows the flow. Small organisms feed small grazers and filter feeders. Those feed somewhat larger animals. Those feed larger fish, seabirds, seals, and eventually the great hunters of the sea. What changes is not the law of loss, but the shape of the pyramid and the speed at which some parts of it turn over. The water column can support explosive abundance. Yet even there, the best human harvests often occur where people intercept dense life before too much energy has been spent climbing upward. This is why so many of the great marine food traditions of humanity are built not around the topmost predators, but around species lower or intermediate in the chain, or around moments when marine productivity becomes exceptionally concentrated. Shellfish beds are one obvious example. Oysters, mussels, clams, limpets, and other invertebrates can be gathered in large quantities with relatively low risk where tides and coastlines permit. Small schooling fish are another. Sardines, anchovies, herring, and similar species can convert planktonic abundance into edible mass with astonishing efficiency, and humans have long exploited them where nets, traps, drying techniques, or seasonal timing allow. Even when communities prize larger fish, the most reliable systems often rest on species that are not the ocean's apex hunters, but its broad middle converters. Salmon present a particularly revealing case. They are predators for part of their lives, feeding on smaller marine organisms and fish, and yet they become one of the most important human foods in entire northern regions. This might look like a contradiction until one sees the ecological trick involved. Salmon are not valuable to humans because they sit near the top in some abstract ranking. They are valuable because the system delivers them in concentrated, predictable runs. They come toward people in great numbers, into narrow rivers, at specific seasons, carrying oceanic productivity inland in bodies rich enough to matter tremendously. Human harvest becomes profitable not because the fish are predators, but because their life cycle collapses the usual difficulty of accessing moving marine energy. The same is true, in a different way, for spawning shoals, trapped estuarine fish, and schooling species pressed against coasts or river mouths. The decisive factor is not merely trophic level, it is access, density, and return. That principle explains much of the apparent contradiction in marine predator eating. People can and do eat predatory fish, but they usually favour those that are abundant enough, safe enough, and catchable enough to justify the effort. Mid-level predators often fit this better than apex species. A cod, for example, may be a hunter of smaller fish and invertebrates. Yet in the right seas and historical periods it exists in such abundance that humans can build entire economies around it. The same was once true for some tuna fisheries, though with far greater technological demands and considerable limits. But a shark is another matter. A shark may be edible and sometimes culturally important, yet its position higher in the chain often brings the familiar problems back with force relative scarcity. Greater contaminant burden in many contexts, danger in capture, and often lower overall efficiency as a staple compared with more numerous alternatives. The evidence remains incomplete for some ancient fisheries, but modern ecological understanding makes the long pattern clearer. Marine peoples are often highly selective even when outsiders imagine the sea as one vast undifferentiated pantry. Seals and other marine mammals complicate the story further because in polar and subpolar regions, they can be enormously important foods despite their own predatory habits. Yet this is not a refutation of the broader rule so much as a reminder that environment changes the available bargains. In Arctic and near-Arctic worlds, plant productivity accessible to humans on land is limited. Agricultural options may be non-existent, and marine ecosystems can provide concentrated fat through animals like seals, walruses, and whales. In such places, humans sensibly turn to what the environment offers in viable form. A seal may be a predator of fish or invertebrates, but it is also a package of desperately valuable fat in a landscape where alternatives are constrained. Here again, necessity and local ecology reshape what counts as efficient. The rule does not vanish, it shifts under the pressure of context. A prey animal's value is always relative to the full menu available. Even in these environments, however, people rarely ignore lower-level abundance where they can access it. Small fish, shellfish, seabirds, eggs, and seasonal concentrations of more numerous marine life often remain crucial. The highest value marine foods are often those that combine rich energy with favourable access. A whale, for example, provides extraordinary return if successfully taken or found stranded. But the scale of that return depends on social organisation, technology, and luck. It does not mean every marine apex or near-apex species becomes sensible routine prey. Human societies repeatedly distinguish among them. Some are worth immense effort under the right conditions. Others are occasional. Others are avoided or taken only under pressure. The problem of toxins at the top also grows sharper in the sea. Modern knowledge has made this impossible to ignore. Large predatory fish and some marine mammals can accumulate mercury and other contaminants to levels that make frequent consumption risky, especially for children and pregnant women. This does not mean all marine predators are equally hazardous, nor that ancient peoples perceive these dangers in modern biochemical terms, but it does reinforce a pattern that many communities likely sensed empirically. In more local ways, some big sea hunters are not ideal daily food. Scholars still debate how much pre-industrial people recognize such patterns as species-specific toxicity versus more general caution. But the structure of the risk is real. The same ecology that thins energy upward can also intensify unwanted burdens upward. There is also a strong technological dimension to marine food choice. On land, humans could often exploit herbivore behavior with coordinated drives, ambushes, and traps. At sea, access depends heavily on boats, hooks, nets, harpoons, tidal knowledge, fish weirs, storage methods, and weather windows. This means some high-return marine predators become viable only when technology reaches the necessary threshold. A society with robust watercraft and cooperative fishing methods may access species that would be impossible or irrational for another society lacking them. Yet technology changes access more than it changes ecology. It can let people reach farther up the chain, but it does not automatically make those species the best foundation food if better returns still lie elsewhere. That is why even highly skilled maritime cultures often rely on a mix of species across levels rather than on apex predators alone. What survives in the archaeological record often reflects this mixed logic. Shell middens point to dense use of intertidal life. Fish bones reveal selective targeting, sometimes heavily focused on a few abundant species. Marine mammal remains appear in some places as central resources, in others as occasional additions. Predator-rich species may show up, but seldom in ways that suggest the entire food system simply leaps to the top. No single explanation fully accounts for every maritime adaptation, because coastlines differ, currents differ, technologies differ, and cultural choices differ, but the broad trend remains recognizable. The most stable marine food strategies tend to exploit concentration, seasonality, and abundance more than mere predatory status. This is why the sea changes the pattern without overturning it. Humans can eat marine predators more often than terrestrial apex hunters, because marine ecosystems sometimes produce those predators in forms that are concentrated, oily, migratory, or catchable enough to matter. Yet the same old pressures remain underneath lower levels, usually support more biomass. Mid-level species often offer better efficiency, and the highest predators frequently bring extra risk, whether through scarcity, danger, or contamination. The ocean seems to offer endless freedom, but it too is governed by transfer and loss. In a way, the marine world only makes the central lesson more interesting. It shows that humans are not following a simple rule like never eat predators. They're following a deeper principle harvest where the return makes sense. Sometimes that includes a predatory fish, a seal, or even a whale, because the surrounding ecology makes those animals unusually valuable. More often, it means intercepting the broader flows beneath them, the schooling fish, the shellfish beds, the spawning runs, the estuarine richness, the thick middle layers where marine productivity gathers in humanly useful form. The sea invites flexibility, but it still rewards the same wisdom ancient hunters learned on land. Do not mistake the dramatic hunter for the most generous meal. Look instead for where energy arrives in numbers, in season, and within reach. There, whether on a windy coast or a grassland plain, human survival finds its surest footing. For much of human history, predators matter more in the mind than on the menu. That is not a contradiction. In fact, it may be exactly what one should expect from animals that are dangerous, rare, difficult to kill, and nutritionally unreliable. Their very unsuitability as ordinary food helps make them powerful as symbols. They are not banal enough to disappear into routine. They resist being reduced to livestock, pantry stock, or predictable seasonal harvest. Instead, they remain vivid at the edge of settlement and imagination, where fear sharpens memory and rarity lends weight. A sheep can feed a household, a lion can define a mythology, a wolf can alter the emotional temperature of an entire landscape without ever becoming anyone's staple meal. This symbolic force appears again and again across cultures because predators occupy a strange position in human life. They are competitors, but also mirrors. They hunt as humans hunt, yet with bodies humans do not possess. They move through darkness, concealment, speed, and sudden violence in ways that seem at once admirable and unsettling. They kill other animals that humans also desire. They threaten children, dogs, herds, and sleep itself. In some places they appear as thieves of meat, in others as guardians of wilderness, in others as embodiments of royal force, martial skill, treachery, fertility, or death. The evidence remains incomplete for many early symbolic systems, and prehistoric images do not come with explanatory captions. But what survives in rock art, carved objects, oral traditions, historical texts, and ritual practice suggests a recurring pattern. Predators become culturally oversized because they are materially difficult to absorb into ordinary life. That difficulty gives them prestige value. A dangerous animal becomes proof of bravery when killed, proof of status when worn, proof of access to power when displayed. Teeth and claws become ornaments not because they are calorically useful, but because they signal contact with danger survived. Skins become cloaks, thrones, saddle coverings, ceremonial garments, and marks of rank because the animal itself is hard to obtain and not easily domesticated into commonness. A chief seated on predator skin, a warrior carrying a leopard hide, a ruler associated with eagle, lion, tiger, or wolf is drawing on the old symbolic reserve of apex life. The message is not nourishment, the message is mastery, ferocity, legitimacy, or alliance with forces outside the ordinary. This is why predators so often enter the architecture of power rather than the kitchen of routine. Eating such animals, when it happens, often participates in the same symbolic economy. The meal is rarely just a meal. It may be a statement that danger has been overcome, a ritual transfer of strength, a form of controlled contamination, or a privilege reserved for specific people under specific rules. In some cases, only certain body parts are consumed. In others, consumption is restricted by age, gender, rank, or ceremonial status. Sometimes the flesh is medicinal rather than dietary in emphasis. Sometimes it is avoided by most people but sought by a few precisely because it is rare or transgressive. Anthropologists have long observed that foods at the edge of a society's moral and ecological order often carry outsized symbolic charge. Predator meat fits that description remarkably well. It is neither simply forbidden nor simply preferred. It is marked. This marking helps explain why communities that do occasionally eat predators still so rarely normalize them as basic food. Ordinary foods must be socially repeatable. They must pass through households without requiring exceptional meaning every time they appear. They must be distributable, expected, and integrated into everyday labor. Predators resist this. The lion, bear, wolf, eagle, crocodile, or leopard arrives wrapped in circumstance. Even when edible, it rarely enters the village as just another carcass. It carries memory of danger, contest, uncertainty, and often taboo. The meat may be shared differently. The hide may matter more than the flesh. The event of the kill may overshadow the meal entirely. No single explanation fully accounts for all such practices, because symbolic systems differ enormously. Yet the common structure remains. Predators are culturally dense in a way staple foods usually are not. There is also an older and perhaps deeper reason for this symbolic weight. Humans may not have always stood so securely above other predators. For much of prehistory, they lived among large carnivores as vulnerable competitors and occasional prey. Lions, hyenas, wolves, leopards, bears, saber-toothed cats in earlier periods, giant raptors in some regions, and crocodilians in others, all formed part of the dangerous environment in which human ancestors evolved. To survive in such worlds was not merely to hunt. It was to negotiate a landscape already occupied by specialists in killing. Scholars still debate the exact intensity of competition and predation pressure in different times and places, but no single explanation is needed to see the broad truth. Human beings learn themselves partly in relation to the dangerous hunters around them. That history would naturally leave a symbolic residue. The predator is not just another animal. It is an ancient rival. Rivals are useful for thinking. They help define boundaries. The predator can represent what humans admire but must control: force without law, appetite without agriculture, cunning without settlement, freedom from the obligations of village life, or it can represent what humans fear becoming isolated, blood-bound, outside kinship, outside order. This is why wolves, lions, bears, tigers, crocodiles, sharks, and birds of prey can be cast so differently across traditions. The same kind of creature may be ancestor in one place, demon in another, royal emblem in a third, hunting teacher in a fourth. The variation is real, but the underlying reason for the variation is consistent. These animals sit close to the edge where human identity defines itself against the non-human world. That edge is sharpened by the fact that predators often act on human economies without ever feeding them much. A wolf pack that harasses livestock, a leopard that takes dogs, a lion near pasture, a crocodile at a ford, an eagle attacking small animals, a shark threatening fishing waters. Each of these exerts material pressure out of proportion to its biomass. A few predators can change settlement pattern, herding practices, watch schedules, architectural choices, weapon habits, and emotional life. They are economically disruptive even when they are not economically nourishing. This makes them perfect subjects for story. People tell stories about what disturbs order. They sing about what kills unexpectedly, what steals in darkness, what tests courage, what defies control. They do not need to eat such creatures often for them to become central in memory. This symbolic prominence can mislead later observers. Looking back through myth and art, one might assume predators were more central to everyday subsistence than they really were. Cave walls show lions, bison, horses, rhinoceroses, mammoths, deer, and other animals in proportion that do not map neatly onto simple diet lists. Historical epics celebrate lion hunts more than sheep management. Folklore remembers wolves more vividly than oxen. Yet subsistence is often least visible where it is most ordinary. The animals that keep people alive can disappear into routine precisely because they are routine. The predator, being rare and consequential, burns brighter in the record of imagination. This is one reason the human relationship to food must always be read through more than stories alone. Meaning magnifies the dramatic, while survival rests on the repeatable. There is, however, a subtle connection between prestige and ecology. Because predators are poor staple food, they remain available to become prestige objects. If lions were as abundant and useful as cattle, they would lose part of what makes them symbolically potent. Their scarcity, difficulty, and danger are the very conditions that create their prestige. In this sense, the ecological inefficiency of predators and their cultural power reinforce one another. The same animal that fails as daily nourishment succeeds magnificently as a sign of exceptional force. What cannot feed everyone can still impress everyone. This also explains why human societies so often reserve predator materials for elites, warriors, ritual specialists, or threshold events. A hide draped over a ruler, a claw necklace worn by a hunter, a ceremonial headdress made from eagle feathers, a tiger bone assigned medicinal value, a crocodile tooth treated as amulet. These are ways of converting ecological rarity into social distinction. The actual animal may provide relatively little meat, but it provides concentrated meaning. Predators become currencies in a symbolic marketplace that runs parallel to the nutritional one. Indeed, the poorer they are as routine food, the easier it becomes for them to migrate into this other economy. What survives in the records suggests that many communities understood the separation clearly. They could admire, fear, and ritualize predators while still relying overwhelmingly on herbivores, fish, gathered plants, and domestic stock for daily life. They did not confuse sacred or prestigious value with caloric value. Modern observers sometimes do, because spectacle is easier to notice than bread, stew, milk, dried fish, or stored grain. But ancient life was built by those quieter foods. The predator stood slightly aside, radiant with meanings precisely because it was not ordinary nourishment. So when humans avoid predators as staple meat, they are not rejecting those animals as unimportant. They are relocating their importance. The wolf enters story more than diet. The lion enters kingship more than storage. The bear enters ceremony more than routine slaughter. The shark enters fear more than daily fishing baskets. These creatures remain central, but central in another dimension. They haunt the border between subsistence and significance. And perhaps that is why the human imagination has never stopped returning to them. The animals that feed us may become familiar enough to vanish into the background of civilization. The animals that threaten us, rival us, and refuse domestication stay luminous. They remind humans that the world is not made only of resources. It is also made of presences that cannot be fully assimilated. The apex predator stands there as one of the last great reminders of a world where power is not necessarily useful, where danger is not necessarily worth consuming, and where some beings become most meaningful precisely because they are better at dominating stories than they are at filling stomachs. Once humans begin to domesticate animals and cultivate plants, the old ecological logic does not disappear. It hardens into institutions. What had once been a hunter's practical wisdom becomes the basis of fields, fences, taxes, tribute, inheritance, and state power. Domestication is often described as a revolution in control, and in many ways it is. People no longer wait only on the movements of wild herds or the luck of the chase. They begin to shape breeding, movement, feeding, protection, and reproduction directly. But the animals they choose for this transformation are not random. They are overwhelmingly the animals that fit the same deep pattern already written across earlier subsistence. They are species that feed low enough on the food chain to convert broad plant abundance into humanly useful wealth. This is one of the clearest confirmations of the whole story. If top predators were truly good foundation food, one might expect human societies to have tamed them at scale, bred them, managed their reproduction, and built systems around their flesh just as they did with sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, camels, yaks, llamas, and other domestic animals. Yet that does not happen, except in marginal or highly specialized ways that never become the backbone of food civilization. The reason is not only temperament, though temperament matters, it is also ecology. A domestic animal must do more than tolerate humans. It must turn available resources into reliable surplus. It must fit into a cycle of feeding that does not consume more than it returns. Predators fail this test almost immediately. To keep a carnivore is to feed an eater rather than a converter. Every pound of flesh a predator gains must come from other animals already raised, hunted, or caught at cost. The old 10% rule reappears here in domestic form. If a community tries to feed itself by breeding predators for meat, it is effectively choosing to pour energy through additional losses before it reaches human mouths. Even if the animal were easy to manage, which most are not, the system would still be wasteful. A wolf raised to eating size would need food that could often have nourished people more directly, or nourished more efficient livestock instead. A lion, tiger, leopard, or bear would be worse still, not only because of danger, but because of sheer resource burden. The evidence from pastoral and agricultural history is overwhelming on this point. Human food systems settle around animals that multiply value, not animals that multiply cost. That is why the great domesticates are so revealing. Sheep and goats turn scrub, grass, and marginal browse into milk, meat, hide, and fibre. Cattle turn pasture and crop residues into traction, manure, milk, blood in some traditions, leather, and enormous social value. Pigs complicate the picture because they are omnivores, but they are still efficient in many human settings precisely because they can consume scraps, waste, tubers, mast, and byproducts that would otherwise be underused. Chickens turn grains, insects, and household waste into eggs and meat. Camels and llamas thrive where other domestic systems struggle. Reindeer can be managed in northern settings because they harvest vegetation inaccessible to human digestion. Again and again, the pattern is the same. Humans favour animals that stand between them and a wider base of productivity. Animals that can make low-level energy more accessible rather than less. Temperament and social structure reinforce the energetic rule beautifully. Many herbivores and some omnivores can be herded, enclosed, bred selectively, or at least habituated to life within human systems. They gather, follow leaders, imprint, tolerate proximity, or reproduce under managed conditions. Predators, by contrast, are often territorial, solitary or differently social, quick to stress, dangerous in confinement, and expensive to feed, even when technically trainable. There are famous cases of tamed or captive predators, of course, from hunting cheetahs to royal menageries to ceremonial keeping of dangerous animals, but these are not food economies. They are prestige practices, entertainment, political theatre, companionship in rare instances, or specialized labor. Scholars still debate why some potentially domesticable species never crossed the threshold while others did. Yet no single explanation is necessary here. The combination of poor energetic return and difficult management already eliminates most predators from serious consideration as staple livestock. The rise of agriculture makes the contrast even more absolute. Once fields begin producing grain, legumes, tubers, and fodder at scale, the question becomes not just which animals people can manage, but which animals fit most profitably into the flow of cultivated calories. Grain can be eaten directly by humans. It can also be fed to animals. If fed to animals, the return must justify the loss involved. That is why most traditional agricultural systems either consume plants directly in large quantity or cycle them through animals that provide multiple benefits: milk, traction, manure, offspring, wool, transport, and meat. Feeding crops to predators would be absurd unless one first fed those crops to prey animals and then fed those prey animals to the predator. The waste compounds instantly. Civilization does not grow by compounding waste where it does not need to. This is not merely a matter of economics in the narrow sense, it is civilizational physics. Large settled populations require repeated, predictable conversion of sunlight into edible and storable form. Grain fields do this directly. Herd animals do this indirectly with acceptable loss while adding labor, fertility, and resilience. Predators do not. A kingdom can count sheep. It can tax cattle. It can redistribute grain. It can estimate milk yield, lambing, calving, fodder needs, and manure supply. These things scale. They can support armies, temple offerings, urban markets, and inheritance systems. Lions cannot be tithed as meat engines. Wolves cannot fertilize fields efficiently. Tigers cannot pull plows. Bears cannot be trusted as routine village biomass. The animals of power remain symbolically potent, but the animals of sustenance become the true skeleton of civilization. This helps explain why so much of social value across the ancient and medieval world is bound up with herbivores. Wealth in cattle, sheep, horses, goats, camels, or similar animals is common because these creatures embody converted landscape in manageable form. They are walking reserves, reproductive capital, mobile stores of protein and fat, and sometimes the engines of transport or tillage themselves. Marriage payments, sacrificial systems, legal fines, and pastoral status all attach to them for practical reasons before symbolism magnifies the pattern further. A predator skin on a throne may signal authority. A herd outside the settlement actually supports it. There is also a revealing asymmetry in how societies handle predators once herding takes hold. The very existence of domestic herbivores often intensifies hostility toward wild carnivores. Wolves, lions, leopards, hyenas, bears, and other predators become more than natural dangers. They become thieves of stored energy. A sheep taken by a wolf is not merely a dead animal. It is grass already converted into human value, labour already invested, future lambs lost, milk reduced, hide denied, and perhaps winter security compromised. From the standpoint of the herder, the predator now attacks not only the herd, but the logic of domestication itself. This is one reason predator control becomes such a persistent feature of pastoral and agricultural societies. It is an energetic conflict as much as a cultural one. Yet even in this intensified conflict, the predator still rarely becomes ordinary food. People may kill it, display it, curse it, fear it, or turn it into a symbol of frontier danger. They may occasionally eat it, but they do not usually fold it into the food machine. That refusal is telling. It shows how clearly the domestic economy distinguishes between converters and disruptors. The sheep is not simply a docile animal. It is a reliable participant in human metabolic strategy. The wolf is not simply frightening. It is metabolically inconvenient. One belongs inside the cycle. The other imposes cost from outside it. No single explanation fully accounts for all domestication pathways, and some domestic choices remain debated. Why zebras were not domesticated successfully while horses were. Why some antelope species resisted management. Why pigs rise in some regions and not others. Why dairying transforms some societies more strongly than others. All of these questions have their own histories. But none of that uncertainty weakens the larger point. The species humans build food civilizations around are overwhelmingly those that make ecological sense under the pressure of scale. They are the animals that let people tap lower trophic productivity again and again with losses low enough to sustain growth. In this light, domestication looks less like a rebellion against nature and more like an extraordinary refinement of natural arithmetic. Humans do not escape the food chain. They reorganize their position inside it. They learn to grow broad bases of plant production and channel portions of that base through selected animals whose biology suits human need. They turn landscapes into managed energy systems. Fields feed granaries, stubble feeds sheep feed households. Cattle pull ploughs that expand fields, manure returns fertility to soil, pigs clean waste streams, chickens patrol the edges of settlement. The whole arrangement is elegant because it works with the grain of ecology rather than against it. Predators remain outside this elegance, magnificent but unsuitable. They can be tamed in stories, chained in courtyards, painted on palace walls, trained for sport in rare cases, or invoked as emblems of kingship. But they do not become the ordinary flesh of villages because their place in the web is wrong for the task. They stand too high, cost too much, and return too little. Humanity, for all its inventiveness, does not waste effort trying to turn the narrow upper edge of the food chain into the base of civilization. It chooses, instead, The old dependable answer animals that eat what humans cannot and return far more than they consume in forms people can store, share, breed, and build upon. So the rise of domestication does not overturn the ancient lesson learned in the hunt. It confirms it with fences and ledgers. The species that fill the human future are not the ones that dominate the wild with tooth and claw, but the ones that patiently gather sunlight from grass, leaves, scraps, and grain, and hold it long enough for human societies to draw life from it. In that sense, every pasture is a quiet victory for the same principle that once guided prehistoric hunters toward the herd and away from the hunter stalking behind it. Civilization expands, but the arithmetic underneath remains the same. Still, there are moments when all of this apparent clarity begins to blur. Famine does that. So does winter that arrives too early, sea ice that shifts hunting routes, drought that empties the grazing lands, war that blocks movement, plague among herd animals, storms that keep boats ashore, or simple bad luck repeated too many times in succession. The elegant logic of choosing efficient prey belongs to worlds where choice still exists. Scarcity reveals what happens when choice contracts. It is in those harder landscapes, those failed seasons, those frontier margins where one food source after another slips away, that humans turn most visibly toward animals they would otherwise leave at the edge of the system. Predators enter the diet more often there, not because they suddenly become good food, but because they become available food in a world where availability has become the central question. This difference between emergency food and foundation food matters enormously. A species can sustain life for a while without ever becoming sensible as a long-term base. History and ethnography are full of such distinctions. People eat bark bread, famine roots, leather boiled into broth, spoiled grain reworked into desperate meals, rodents, insects, and animals they would avoid in prosperous times. None of these automatically become preferred staples afterward. Predator meat often belongs in the same category. It is what enters the pot when ordinary filters break down, when waste becomes impossible, and when the future is narrowed to getting through another week or another season. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases because famine leaves chaotic records, but enough survives to show the pattern clearly. Scarcity does not erase the old arithmetic. It merely lowers the threshold at which a bad bargain becomes worth making. This is especially visible in northern and frontier environments, where the margin between sufficiency and shortage can be painfully thin. A trapper deep in winter country, a small group cut off from larger game, a storm-bound coastal settlement, a war party stranded far from planned supplies, a mountain pass crossed too late in the season in such places, an animal that would normally be dismissed as lean, dangerous, or symbolically improper may become necessary. Fox, wolf, wild cat, raptor, scavenger, or predatory fish can all shift category under pressure. Yet even here human behavior is revealing. People often continue to rank such foods differently. They may eat them reluctantly, reserve them for crisis, or attach language of hardship to them. The act of consumption does not automatically make the animal normal. Quite often the memory of necessity clings to the species afterward. Arctic and subarctic lifeways offer one of the most interesting versions of this tension. In these environments, some predators and near-predators become genuinely important, but only because the surrounding ecological menu is so different from temperate agrarian worlds. Marine mammals, certain large fish, and occasionally terrestrial carnivores may supply the fats required for survival where plant foods are limited and herbivore migrations fluctuate. Yet even in such settings, people remain highly selective. They know which species are worth the danger, which require special preparation, which are best in certain seasons, and which are fallback rather than preference. Scholars still debate how often some carnivores were eaten regularly versus under duress in particular Arctic societies, and broad generalization can mislead. But the deeper principle still holds. When predators do enter survival systems more strongly, it is because the environment has rearranged the available bargains, not because the old inefficiencies vanished. War creates another set of exceptions. Armies on campaign, besieged towns, refugees moving through broken territory, and frontier outposts can all become detached from their usual food base. Herds may be lost, fields burned, storehouses emptied, hunting grounds contested. Under those conditions, a predator killed near camp is no longer weighed against an ideal menu, it is weighed against nothing. Historical crises repeatedly show how fast food categories can collapse under pressure. Animals that would never appear on elite tables become acceptable or unavoidable. Dogs, cats, rats, carrion birds, and occasionally larger predators enter survival diets not because culture ceases to matter, but because survival begins to outrank it. Once more, this does not make such foods efficient in the larger sense. It merely shows how broad the human survival response can become when systems fail. There is also a quiet but important difference between habitual scarcity and sudden catastrophe. Communities accustomed to marginal environments often develop structured knowledge for using difficult foods, including predator species, in measured and culturally integrated ways. They may know how to prepare them safely, when to avoid them, and how to fit them into broader mixed diets without romanticizing them. By contrast, populations thrown abruptly into famine often approach such foods without stable custom, which can increase risk, disgust, and confusion. What survives in the record suggests that cultural familiarity matters almost as much as ecological opportunity. A predator species eaten occasionally within a well-understood subsistence tradition is one thing. The same species eaten in panic by people with no preparation is another. One reflects adaptation, the other reflects breakdown. This is why emergency eating must never be mistaken for endorsement. The starving human body will accept bargains the well-fed community rejects for good reason. A dangerous carnivore with poor fat return may still be worth killing if there is literally nothing else to kill. A shark with questionable risk may still be butchered if the boat returns empty otherwise. A bear taken late in the season may matter immensely if reserves are gone. In such cases, the extraordinary flexibility of humans becomes visible. They can step outside their preferred food logic because they are omnivores with memory, tools, and an immense capacity for improvisation. But improvisation does not change the structure of the world. It only buys time within it. One of the most revealing clues lies in what happens after scarcity passes. Communities do not usually continue eating predator meat at the same rate once richer options return. They move back toward the animals and foods that offer stronger, safer, more repeatable returns. Herd animals regain primacy. Fish runs matter again. Stored grains, roots, milk, small stock, shellfish, and more profitable wild prey return to the center. The predator recedes toward the edge from which crisis briefly pulled it. This rebound is important. It shows that scarcity may distort diet, but it rarely rewrites the long-term human verdict about what is worth building life upon. There are, however, some frontier worlds where the edge itself lasts for generations. Fur trade zones, isolated islands, seasonal ice margins, desert caravan routes, mountain interiors, and contested steppe borders can produce food habits that look unusual from the perspective of richer agricultural regions. There, opportunism becomes normalized. A species that is emergency food somewhere else may become periodically accepted simply because the environment never offers abundance for long. Yet even in these worlds, people tend to know the hierarchy of foods clearly. They know what they would rather have, what they settle for, and what they reserve for the worst times. The hierarchy itself is the fingerprint of the deeper ecological rule. No single explanation fully accounts for all these exceptional cases, because desperation is shaped by local climate, technology, cultural values, and the timing of failure. But taken together, they reveal something essential about humans. They are not rigid followers of efficiency. They are strategic survivors. They can absorb temporary losses in dietary elegance. They can exploit what would normally be too risky, too lean, or too symbolically charged. They can turn even a poor trophic choice into a momentary solution. That flexibility is part of what made the species so successful. A less adaptable animal would have perished in many of the landscapes humans managed to cross. And yet adaptability has limits of its own. A fallback food is not a stable future. You can survive on bad bargains for a while, but you cannot usually organize generations around them. That is why scarcity stories so often end in either recovery or collapse. If herds return, if stores are rebuilt, if the fish come back, if fields are replanted, life moves back toward the lower and broader levels that support continuity. If they do not, no number of dangerous sporadic predator kills can sustain large populations for long. The old constraints close in again. This is perhaps the clearest way to understand predator eating in times of hardship. It is not a hidden alternative civilization forgot. It is a sign of pressure. It appears where food systems are strained, where mobility is broken, where environmental windows are narrow, or where people live in extreme ecologies that force sharper compromises than usual. The predator enters the diet not as triumph, but as evidence that the ordinary, more generous channels have thinned or disappeared. By the fire in a bad year, this truth would be felt with painful immediacy. The carcass on the ground is not a theory. It is tonight's chance, perhaps the only one. No one standing over it needs to believe it is ideal. It only needs to be enough. But human memory is long, and communities remember what kind of food belongs to hard times. They remember the strain attached to it, the caution, the illness, the lean returns, the stories told afterward with relief rather than pride. And when better options return, people move toward them almost automatically, back toward the animals and plants that gather the world more generously. Scarcity teaches flexibility. Recovery restores preference. Together, they reveal that the old rule was never moral or absolute. It was practical all along. What ancient hunters learned through bruised hands, cold camps, lucky seasons, and costly failures now appears in the language of ecology, anthropology, archaeology, and nutritional science with striking clarity. The insight is no longer hidden inside custom alone. It has been measured, modelled, tested across landscapes, and observed in systems far removed from the world of spears and firelight. The remarkable thing is not that modern science overturns the old human pattern. It is that it so often confirms it, again and again. The picture resolves into the same broad truth. Stable human food systems thrive where they draw most heavily from the lower and wider levels of energy flow, not from the narrow and expensive heights where top predators live. Ecology provides the clearest framework. Energy enters ecosystems through primary production and is then diminished through each transfer upward. The 10% rule remains a simplification, but it captures something real enough to be immensely useful. Whether the exact number is higher or lower in a given context, the direction never changes. Most energy is lost as heat, metabolism, movement, waste, and all the other costs of being alive. This means that apex predators represent only a tiny fraction of total living productivity. The fact that they dominate imagination does not change the fact that they sit on top of a steep attrition process. A lion, wolf, shark, or eagle is therefore not simply another package of edible biomass. It is the residue of a long series of energetic reductions. Modern ecology makes explicit what old subsistence practice already respected instinctively: the higher one harvests, the thinner the return tends to become. Archaeology reinforces the same point from the ground up. Faunal remains from prehistoric camps and settlements across many regions repeatedly show heavy reliance on herbivores, mid-level prey, concentrated aquatic resources, and domestic animals once domestication appears. Predator bones are certainly present in some assemblages, sometimes with cut marks, burning, or other signs of processing, but they are rarely dominant in the way major food species are dominant. Scholars still debate individual sites because preservation is uneven and motives are not always visible in bone. A predator skeleton with butchery marks may reflect hunger, ritual, opportunism, defense, or some combination of all four. Yet once enough sites are compared, the signal becomes difficult to miss. Humans may interact intensely with predators, but the ordinary bulk of subsistence usually lies elsewhere. Anthropology adds another layer by showing how living and recently documented societies distinguish between what can be eaten and what is good to live on. This is one of the most important differences in the entire story. Human beings are extraordinarily broad-spectrum feeders. The range of things they can eat is immense, but the range of things they repeatedly choose as staple foods is much narrower. That narrowing is shaped by culture, of course, but culture itself often sits on a base of practical experience. Foods become preferred because they are reliable, abundant, manageable, and compatible with long-term health and labor patterns. Foods become occasional, ceremonial, emergency, taboo, or medicinal because they fail one or more of those tests. Predator meat so often ends up in those secondary categories that the pattern itself demands explanation. Modern anthropological comparison supplies its cultural differences real, but it usually plays out within ecological limits rather than outside them. Nutritional science sharpens the picture still further. The body does not live on symbolism, it lives on usable energy, amino acids, micronutrients, and critically, the balance among protein, fat, and in some societies carbohydrate-rich staples. A prey animal that offers dense fat stores, marrow, organs, and substantial edible mass can carry a community far more effectively than an equally dramatic but leaner predator. The modern understanding of protein excess without sufficient non-protein energy helps explain why so many traditional food systems prize fat so intensely. It also clarifies why animals built for action, rather than storage, may disappoint as regular food, even if they appear formidable. What ancient hunters learned with knives and winters, science now explains with metabolism and physiology. The verdict is much the same. Not all meat is equal. Disease ecology confirms another old caution. Predators and scavengers often face heightened exposure to parasites and pathogens through the bodies they consume. Modern medicine can identify trichinella, toxoplasmosis, various bacterial risks, and the concentrated contaminant burdens of some high trophic marine species with precision that earlier peoples lacked. Yet the practical conclusion is familiar. Animals higher in the chain often require more caution, more selective use, and sometimes outright avoidance as routine food. Here again, Modern knowledge does not make traditional caution look primitive. It often makes it look perceptive. Communities that learn to distrust some meats, restrict some species, or treat certain predator bodies as dangerous were not necessarily trapped in irrational taboo. In many cases, they were preserving empirical wisdom in cultural form. This convergence between old practice and new science is especially revealing because it shows that human food history is not built on mere habit. It is built on repeated negotiation with physical reality. People did not avoid making predators into staple food simply because they lacked imagination or courage. They avoided it because ecosystems penalize that choice. Science now shows the penalties in multiple ways at once: energetic inefficiency, low biomass availability, greater risk in acquisition, often poorer fat return, and elevated biological hazards in many cases. No single explanation fully accounts for every food pattern, because there are always local exceptions and cultural overlays. But when several lines of evidence point toward the same conclusion, the depth of the conclusion becomes hard to escape. Even modern industrial civilization, for all its apparent distance from ancient life, has not transcended this logic. It often hides it. Factory farming, global shipping, refrigeration, feedlots, aquaculture, and synthetic fertilizers can obscure where energy is really being spent. Yet the underlying arithmetic still governs outcomes. Feeding grain to livestock involves losses compared with direct human consumption of grain. Feeding animals to carnivorous aquaculture species compounds losses further. Large predatory fish remain vulnerable to overharvest, partly because the ocean can produce only limited apex biomass relative to the base beneath it. Public health warnings about high trophic marine foods echo ancient selectivity in new language. Even contemporary dietary debates often circle, knowingly or not, around the same ancient tension between abundance, efficiency, prestige, and ecological cost. There is something almost humbling in this continuity. Humans have transformed their tools beyond recognition, but not their dependence on the deep structure of the food web. A person ordering fish in a modern city, a herder crossing dry pasture, an Iron Age farmer slaughtering a goat, a coastal forager gathering shellfish, and a Paleolithic hunter tracking reindeer are all, in different ways, engaging with the same reality. Food is thickest where energy has not been forced through too many costly lives before reaching human hands. The details change, the principle does not. What survives in the record also suggests that humans often sensed this principle even when they wrapped it in other language. They spoke of good hunting grounds, rich water, fat animals, dangerous meat, unlucky seasons, animals worth chasing, and animals not worth the risk. These are not naive categories. They are ecological judgments framed through lived consequence. Modern science translates them rather than replacing them. It takes the old vocabulary of camp, herd, season, sickness, and abundance, and shows the mechanisms beneath it. The translation is so successful because the underlying observations were often sound. This has wider implications than diet alone. It helps explain why human population density tends to rise where lower-level productivity can be harvested effectively. It helps explain why agricultural societies repeatedly narrow their food base around plants and domestic herbivores. It helps explain why apex predators remain ecologically important, yet economically marginal in most human systems. It helps explain why prestige foods and practical foods so often diverge, and why things that symbolize power are not always things that support life best. In other words, the question of why humans avoid predators as food opens outward into a general lesson about civilization. Human beings may dream at the top of the chain, but they survive lower down. Scholars still debate details, as they should. Exact prehistoric diets differ by region. Some marine systems complicate trophic assumptions. Bears, seals, and certain fish blur ordinary categories. Cultural meanings alter what is acceptable. Climatic extremes rearrange the menu. The evidence remains incomplete in many places. No single explanation fully accounts for every local pattern. Yet these qualifications do not weaken the central case. They refine it. They show that the principle is strong enough to survive complexity. The rule is not absolute, but it is resilient. And perhaps that resilience is the most important thing modern science has to offer this story. It reveals that what looks, at first, like a curious dietary preference is actually one expression of a far older law governing life on Earth. Human beings are exceptional in many ways, but they are not exempt from transfer loss, from trophic bottlenecks, from the cost of turning one body into another. They can exploit the web brilliantly. They can alter landscapes, domesticate herds, and fish whole seas, but they cannot make the top of the pyramid broad. So when science looks back at the choices made by ancient hunters, early herders, and settled farmers, it does not find mere superstition. It finds adaptation sharpened by consequence. It finds people repeatedly discovering that the most dramatic animal is not necessarily the best meal. That fear and prestige are poor guides to subsistence, and that the richest current of nourishment usually runs beneath the apex, not through it. In that sense, the old human instinct was not only practical, it was scientifically sound long before science had a name for it. By the end of the story, the question turns quietly back on the species that asked it. Why do humans so rarely build their food systems around predators? Because humans, for all their intelligence and reach, are not standing outside the food web judging it from above. They are inside it, governed by the same narrowing flows as everything else. They may be the most versatile hunter the planet has produced. They may kill with stone, fire, traps, projectiles, boats, engines, and industrial nets. They may spread into almost every climate on Earth. Yet none of that changes the deeper fact that they are still bound to the arithmetic of transfer. Their success comes not from breaking the food chain, but from reading it more cleverly than other animals do. That is the final irony. Humans often imagine themselves as apex predators, and in one sense they are. They can kill nearly anything if they decide to. They can hunt in groups larger than wolf packs, coordinate beyond sight, remember beyond a single season, pass techniques across generations, and turn knowledge into force with extraordinary precision. A lion is dangerous in the present. A human is dangerous in the future as well, because a human can plan. This gives the species an unusual position near the top of many ecological systems. Yet being able to dominate the top is not the same as being able to live off the top efficiently. The very intelligence that makes humans formidable also teaches them not to rely on the most expensive prey. In a sense, the true mark of the human predator is not that it eats the highest animals. It is that it usually chooses not to. This separates humans from many other carnivores in an important way. A wolf cannot choose to become a grazer. A lion cannot turn a grassland into stored grain. An eagle cannot keep herds. Predators in the ordinary animal sense are trapped by anatomy and instinct within a narrower set of options. Humans are different because they are behavioral opportunists on a grand scale. They can hunt, fish, gather, herd, cultivate, ferment, dry, store, and trade. They can step sideways across ecosystems instead of climbing blindly upward within one. That flexibility is one of the species' greatest advantages. It allows people to remain near the top in power while feeding lower in practice. They can occupy a dominant ecological role while drawing much of their nourishment from animals and plants far below the apex. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire success of Homo sapiens, but this ability to decouple dominance from diet is surely part of it. It also helps explain why human history so often looks like a long attempt to widen the base beneath human life, rather than intensify its position at the top. Hunters seek herd animals, fish runs, shellfish beds, bird colonies, and migration corridors. Herders multiply domestic stock that feed on grass or browse. Farmers expand the direct capture of plant productivity across entire landscapes. States arise where these flows become predictable enough to tax. Cities grow where stored surpluses can feed people far from the place of production. Even empires depend less on the drama of predation than on the dull miracle of controlled abundance. The most powerful human societies are not those that eat the fiercest animals. They are those that command the widest and most reliable streams of lower-level energy. This means the human species is both predator and strategist in a way no other large hunter can be. It kills upward, downward, and across. It scavenges when useful, competes when needed, domesticates when possible, and processes when necessary. It has no fixed trophic identity in the rigid sense. Scholars still debate how best to describe the human ecological niche, because humans are omnivores, engineers, social learners, and niche constructors all at once. But what survives through all the complexity is a simple pattern. Humans flourish most where they can intercept productivity before too much has been lost. That is why they cultivate grasses, keep herbivores, net fish in numbers, and gather shellfish by the basket. It is why they can admire the tiger while breeding goats, fear the shark while harvesting smaller fish, and tell stories about wolves while guarding sheep. There is also a moral temptation in stories like this, the temptation to imagine that humans have somehow escaped the natural order because they dominate so much of it. The history of food suggests the opposite. Human power may be unusual in scale, but it remains deeply dependent on constraints older than humanity itself. The species can devastate ecosystems. Yes, it can remove predators, overhunt prey, and simplify food webs to dangerous extremes. It can behave as though the old limits no longer apply, but when the underlying productivity of land and sea declines, when soils fail, when herds collapse, when fisheries crash, when the broad base thins, human vulnerability returns with startling speed. The apex position was never enough by itself. It depended all along on what lay below. This is perhaps why predators have fascinated humans so deeply. They embody a kind of concentrated power humans understand instinctively. Yet they also reveal the limits of that power. The lion rules its immediate territory, but remains dependent on antelope. The shark dominates a marine corridor, yet depends on lower waters thick with life. The eagle commands the air, but cannot eat prestige. And humans, for all their cities and machines, still depend on fields, pastures, rivers, plankton blooms, grazing cycles, and all the low, wide systems that quietly sustain the visible heights. In every case, the apex rests on a base it did not create for itself. To ignore that base is to misunderstand the whole structure. The ancient choice to avoid predators as staple food therefore turns out to be more than a dietary habit. It is a clue to how humans survive as a species. They do not win by chasing prestige through the food chain. They win by understanding that prestige is irrelevant to hunger. They do not build lasting systems around rarity, danger, and symbolic force. They build them around repeatable return. they are clever enough to know the difference. This may be one of the least glamorous truths in human history, but it is one of the most important. Civilization stands not on the bodies of kings of beasts, but on grain heads, grazing mouths, fattened animals, schooling fish, and the countless humble forms of life through which energy remains abundant enough to share. What survives in the long arc of the past suggests that the human species learned this lesson repeatedly, in many languages and many landscapes. It learned it on cold steppes following reindeer. It learned it on African plains watching herds and the cats that shadowed them. It learned it beside shell middens on coasts where tides gave generously. It learned it in corrals and barns, in milk pails and granaries, in smokehouses and drying racks. It learned it in famine too, by discovering what bad bargains look like when there is no alternative, and modern science, arriving very late, merely confirmed what experience had already engraved: the higher the hunter, the thinner the stream. So the final image is not of humanity standing triumphant above the web of life, feeding on whatever it pleases. It is of humanity doing something more subtle and perhaps more impressive. It is of a species that became powerful not by ignoring natural law, but by learning where natural law bends enough to be used. Humans became the great ecological opportunists of the planet. They could kill predators, but they did not need to live on them. They could fear them, worship them, imitate them, exterminate them, or occasionally eat them. Yet when survival had to be repeated across generations, they kept turning back toward the broader currents where the world still offered enough. And that is the real answer hidden inside the question. Humans avoid predators as food, not because predators are forbidden, nor because they are always inedible, nor because people lack courage. They avoid building life around them because predators sit at the wrong end of the great equation. Too much has already been lost by the time energy reaches them. Too much danger surrounds them. Too much uncertainty clings to their flesh. The human animal, for all its myths of domination, remains wise enough to know that survival does not belong to what looks strongest. It belongs to what returns enough. The fire has burned lower now, and the shapes beyond it are harder to separate. Somewhere in the dark there are still hunters moving through the grass, through trees, through cold surf and under ice, following the same impulses that ruled the world long before any human name existed for them. Somewhere too there are grazing animals feeding patiently, and schools of fish turning in dim water, and leaves gathering light with no knowledge of what depends on them. The whole structure goes on, quiet and immense, whether anyone notices or not. Human beings entered that structure late, and for a long time they must have seemed fragile inside it, soft-skinned, slow-clawed, born helpless, easy to kill. Yet they endured by noticing what mattered, not simply what frightened them, and not simply what dazzled them, but what sustained them. That may be one of the deepest forms of intelligence the species ever developed: the ability to look past spectacle and choose the richer current underneath. To understand that the wolf is powerful, but the deer is food, that the lion is magnificent, but the herd is life, that the sea's great hunter is impressive, but the thick turning schools below it are what keep hunger back. In the end, this is not only a story about predators, it is a story about limits and about the strange humility hidden inside human success. For all the tools, all the planning, all the stories of mastery, people never stop depending on the old generosity of the lower world, on grass turned into muscle, on grain turned into bread, on sunlight trapped in leaves, then in bodies, then carried into camp in forms humble enough to be repeated. The great predators remained where they always were: feared, admired, sometimes killed, sometimes eaten, often remembered, but rarely trusted with the business of survival. Perhaps that is why they stay so luminous in memory. They remind humans of the world's sharp edges, of the older order beyond fences and fields, of the fact that power and sustenance are not the same thing. A creature may rule the dark and still be a poor meal. A species may rule the planet and still depend on grass, fish, seeds, and herds. There is a quiet dignity in that recognition. It pulls the story away from conquest and back toward belonging. And so the last image is simple. A human camp somewhere in deep time, meat drying in the cold air, fat set aside carefully, bones split for marrow, children sleeping, beyond the reach of the fire, eyes watching from the dark. The predator remains out there, where it belongs in story and shadow. The people remain by the fire, alive because they chose, again and again. Not the most dramatic animal in the landscape, but the one that carried enough of the landscape inside it to keep them going.